Murder, She Wrote. The Helly Bacon Company in Houston, Texas, offers helicopter rides over forested lands to massacre wild pigs using automatic weapons. Patrons, virtually all men, choose from among dozens of different weapons, from shotguns, carbines, and Glocks to a belt-driven Browning M1250 caliber machine gun, a massive anti-aircraft weapon that has been used by the U.S. military in dozens of conflicts, including Vietnam and Iraq. The kinetic energy of a single 50 round on a body is enough to turn organs into pulp and bones into splinters. The U.S. military has long used live goats and pigs as experimental subjects to study the physiological effects of high-velocity rounds, partly to provide surgeons with experience in treating battlefield trauma. As the copters swoop down over the terrified animals, Helly Bacon's guides indicate desirable targets like sounders, groups of mother pigs and their piglets. Pigs not killed outright lapse into shock, dying slowly from their wounds and staggering in agony with their shattered intestines or other organs hanging out, as the men hoot with delight. Aristotle described hunting as war against animals, and war as the hunting of humans, and the two practices have always been the province of men. Nothing indeed more defines the masculine as soldiering and hunting. As ecofeminist Marty Keel observed, the hunter's intimacy with death, his ritual of oneness with nature, serves to confirm his masculine self-identity. The same holds true of warfare, the ultimate proving ground of masculine prowess. 4 out of 5 hunters and 9 out of 10 recreational fishers in the U.S. are men. About the same percentage of men occupy combat roles in the U.S. military. Soldiers refer to combat as hunting enemy soldiers. Sports hunters, meanwhile, invoke the language of war and its sadistic violence. A cover story in Hunting magazine, entitled Calling All Killers, features a photograph of a rugged white man in military camouflage and face paint on its cover, holding a rifle with a scope in one hand and a dead fox in the other. In Elk Hunter, Marlin, and hundreds of other magazines catering to fetishes for killing particular species, advertisers hawk military-grade weapons and accessories, night vision goggles, sniper scopes, hollow-point bullets, combat knives, range finders. Helly Bacon boasts that its Bell 212 helicopter has been adapted by many countries for national defense forces. The company's high-end promotional video depicts a helicopter flying against a red sun, an homage to a scene in the film Apocalypse Now of a fleet of Bell UH-1 Hueys on their way to mow down civilians in a Vietnamese village. The multi-billion-dollar industry in hunting and fishing, like the animal economy generally, is so obviously a patriarchal enterprise that it seems almost redundant to point it out. The double helix of human supremacism and capitalism, described in an earlier chapter, is rooted in masculinist violence, and the same is true of the animal economy through which the two systems find their confluence. It was white men from Europe who invaded the Americas and used cattle, horses, and dogs to subjugate the native human inhabitants, whom they raped, enslaved, and exterminated. A historical trauma whose faint imprint still lingers in ranching culture, with its iconic trope of the cowboy rounding up sheep or cows on horseback, wielding a whip. As Carol Adams shows in The Sexual Politics of Meat, meat-eating and the killing of animals have in fact been associated with masculinity and the domination of women for thousands of years. It is still men who take over the barbecue pit and fire up the grill, and men who are supposed to need and crave animal flesh more than women. In 2006, Burger King rewrote the lyrics to Helen Reddy's famous 1970s feminist anthem, I Am Woman, linking masculinity and meat consumption to promote its Texas Double Whopper burger. The ad depicted angry men streaming into the streets to protest against feminine, emasculating foods, shouting, I will eat this meat. I am man. Hear me roar slash in numbers too big to ignore slash and I'm way too hungry to settle for chick food. Slash oh yes I'm a guy. Slash I'll admit I've been fed quiche. Slash wave tofu bye-bye. Slash now it's for Whopper beef I reach. Hungry Man Dinners, the popular meat-based frozen meals, are still advertised today with the slogan, "Eat like a man." Today, the more the animal system comes into doubt as a result of its ecological contradictions and pandemic risks, the more it has become necessary to shore up the gendered nature of meat as a source not only of nutrition, but of masculine virtue. TV shows like Duck Dynasty and Deadliest Catch reinforce our association of masculinity with meat and the killing of animals. Sexist pundits like psychologist Jordan Peterson and talk show host Joe Rogan, meanwhile, promote best-selling books like The Carnivore Diet, which recommends a meat-only diet. Meat has even become a flashpoint in the culture wars, with Republicans in dozens of U.S. states pushing legislation to ban vegan foods and cellular meats, a defense not merely of their states' economies, but of white, rural masculinity. Since compassion is viewed as a weakness in boys and men, veganism is associated with effeminacy. To impugn the masculinity of liberal men, therefore, the political right has taken to deriding liberal men as soy boys, much as white Europeans in the 19th century ridiculed the effeminate rice eaters of Asian peoples to justify colonialism. Tofu has been eaten by Japanese, Chinese, and Korean peoples for millennia. The animus in American media culture against tofu is partly rooted in anti-Asian racism. Even as the effort to anchor masculinity in violence against animals intensifies, however, we are paradoxically seeing an effort to involve more women in the domination of animals. While it is still overwhelmingly men who run the cattle, dairy, and meat industries, and who hunt, fish, and trap animals for sport, we are seeing a cultural shift in the way society represents men, women, and animals. One of the most striking things about the new carnivory, in fact, is that it is often being promoted with the greatest enthusiasm and moxie not by men, as one might expect, but by women. In thousands of news stories, magazine articles, books, films, and blogs, women are being celebrated for taking up new roles as pig farmers, cattle ranchers, butchers, and hunters. Killing animals is no longer exclusively men's work, the stories tell us, but the very horizon of women's empowerment. As Lily McCauley writes in The Call of the Mild, "Learning to Hunt My Own Dinner," an account of her transition from urban journalist to big game hunter, hunting is the final frontier of feminism. Such a notion, that dominating and herding animals is a path to women's liberation, would have startled feminists of earlier generations. Scarcely a human being in the course of history has fallen to a woman's rifle. Virginia Woolf pointedly observed in Three Guineas, "The vast majority of birds and beasts have been killed by you, not by us." From the vegetarian Amazonian women in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's utopian sci-fi novel Herland, 1915, to Frida Kahlo's self-portrait as a wounded deer pierced with arrows, feminists have long emphasized the parallels between male domination of women and masculine cruelty towards non-human animals, but no longer. In 2010, journalist Peggy Orenstein wrote an influential article for the New York Times, "The Femivore's Dilemma: Can Chickens Save the Desperate Housewife?" describing scores of women who had flocked to farming, hunting, and butchery as a form of self-empowerment. Since then, thousands of other women have joined in. For these women, nothing could be more repugnant than the musty feminism of their predecessors, with its specter of an angry activist clutching her dog-eared vegetarian moosewood cookbook as tightly as she clung to her millenarian fervor. These post-feminists don't want to unseat patriarchy, they want a seat at the table. They want to lean in, and they want their grass-fed steaks lean, too. More than a cultural curiosity, the femivore phenomenon has become central to society's efforts to legitimate the failing meat economy. By depicting violence against animals as a form of women's empowerment and maternal care, femivorism is providing patriarchal society with a novel set of rationales for maintaining its boundless cruelties. The new feminine mystique. Until recently, the literary expositors of husbandry and hunting were nearly all men. Writers like hunter-rancher Wes Jackson and organic agriculture expert J.I. Rodell. Today, however, more and more women are leading the charge. Dozens of women have written memoirs about dominating animals as a way to achieve a purpose-driven life. Women have written books about designing humane slaughterhouses, humane livestock handling, or becoming taxidermists, still life. About becoming cattle ranchers, My Ranch, too. A Wyoming memoir, or Marrying Them, Righteous Pork Chop, Becoming Butchers, Killing It. An Education, or Marrying Them, Cleaving. A Story of Marriage, Meat, and Obsession. By far the most common books in the genre, though, are memoirs by novice women farmers. With dozens of such books in print, sporting titles like Hit by a Farm, Confessions of a Counterfeit Farm Girl, Country Grit, A Farmoir of Finding Purpose and Love, and Barnheart, The Incurable Longing for a Farm of One's Own. The women's farming memoir has become a leading genre in contemporary women's nonfiction. Many of the books are bestsellers that have been lavished with praise by critics. The memoirs take the form of the Bildungsroman, the coming-of-age novel popular in the 19th century, depicting the moral and psychological maturation of its youthful protagonist. In the classic Bildungsroman, the male protagonist feels restless or lost and casts about for some purpose adequate to his ambitions and passions. The hero struggles with self-doubt, lost love, or personal setbacks. By the end, however, he has triumphed over adversity and forged a more authentic self. The Femivore Bildungsroman traces a similar narrative arc, recounting its author's painful path to self-discovery and self-reliance. Unlike the hero of the traditional Bildungsroman, however, the memoirists are able to achieve authenticity only by dominating animals. In The Feminine Mystique, 1963, Betty Friedan famously addressed the tedium and alienation of the suburban housewife. Women who'd benefited most from the economic boom of the 1950s, and for whom life was supposed to be good, felt instead a strange stirring, a dissatisfaction, a yearning for something more. In interviews, women from all walks of life, though mostly middle-class white women, told Friedan of a problem that has no name. Sometimes, Friedan wrote, a woman would say, I feel empty somehow, incomplete, or she would say, I feel as if I don't exist. As one woman tells her, I've tried everything women are supposed to do, hobbies, gardening, pickling, canning, being very social with my neighbors, joining committees, running PTAs, but nothing works. The authors of the women's farming memoirs, nearly all of them white and comfortably middle class or affluent, sound a lot like the women profiled by Friedan, expressing similar feelings of dislocation or alienation. As the books begin, the women are reeling from romantic or professional blows, or both. A former food reporter for the Chicago Tribune takes up animal farming when she finds herself, without income, heartbroken and terrified, after being left by her husband and fired from her job. In Killing It, An Education, Camus Davis's chronicle of her transformation from magazine editor to celebrity butcher, the author begins her story walking away from her personal ground zero. Having recently lost a 10-year relationship and been fired from her job at the foodie magazine Saveur. I broke my own heart. I wrecked my career, Davis writes. Who was I? Where was I? Like many restless American writers before her, she flees the wreckage of her life for the relative safety of Europe. Ernest Hemingway went to Spain to drink and watch bullfights. Davis travels to the French countryside to be tutored in the fine arts of butchery and charcuterie. For most of the memoirists, though, the problem isn't losing a job, it's having one. Alienated from corporate life and feeling burned out, apathetic, and bored. With what they term their sheltered and spoiled urban lives, the women walk away from lucrative positions as journalists, editors, food critics, and marketing directors. Though there are many ways to address feelings of alienation, from therapy to volunteering in a soup kitchen, for these women only the farming cure will do. Feminists once dreamed of changing the world. All these memoirists want is a farm of their own, or rather, an animal farm of their own. Though many of the women grow vegetables and fruit, too, It is no part of their vision to lord it over an apple orchard or petunia patch. 40 acres, yes, but the mule's the thing. Driving the women from their urban lives is what Jenna Wagenrich, the author of 2 farming memoirs, calls barnheart, a condition suffered by those who wish to God we were outside with our flocks, feed bags, or harnesses, instead of sitting in front of the computer screen. Women who are overcome with the desire to be tagging cattle ears or feeding pigs. As she observes in One Woman Farm, farming is a way to prove that, as a single woman, I can manage an entire flock. For women grown tired of having to please their boss one minute, then rush home to begin the second shift the next, controlling animals is a way to escape feeling controlled themselves. I'm damn sure a ewe trying to deliver a lamb doesn't care about meeting a spreadsheet deadline, Wagenrich writes. Tired of being tethered to the corporate machine, now she'll do the tethering. Bereft of community and a sense of deeper purpose, the women flee metropolises like New York, San Francisco, and Seattle to homestead in rural townships in Michigan or Wisconsin, alone or with a lover or spouse or, more rarely, a family in tow. For Susan McCorkindale, a senior marketing director at Family Circle, not even $400 sea salt pedicures and a $30,000 year-end bonus can relieve the stressful tedium of her privileged life. She and her husband buy a 500-acre beef farm in Virginia. Jessie Nadler, a senior editor with a woman's magazine, exchanges her life in Manhattan, where she splurged on Mias, partied hard and lived for Kundalini yoga, for down-home life on a farm in the Badlands of Montana. No sooner are the women ensconced in their farmhouses, however, than their troubles begin. The novice farmers make blunders, struggle with doubt, and contend with early frosts and broken farm equipment. The flint against which the women strike their souls, though, are the animals they raise for slaughter. In Chickens in the Road, Suzanne McMinn's coming-of-age story of a woman in her 40s, a chronicle of her transformation from publishing diva to reluctant pasture princess. Raising animals satisfies the author's deep-seated need to test myself, and milking a cow made me prove myself every single day. For Kristen Kimball, an Ivy Leaguer from an aristocratic East Coast family, dominating animals affects her metamorphosis from party girl who stays out until 4, wears heels, and carries a handbag to cowgirl who can shoot a gun, dispatch a chicken, dodge a charging bull, and ride out a runaway animal behind panicked horses. Scenes in which the author exerts mastery over a large animal feature prominently in many of the books, signposts along the road to self-sufficiency. Seeing another woman controlling a horse named Steel for the first time, Wagenrich admires how she converses with Steel through the black leather lines, her voice, and her carriage whip. Wagenrich soon learns this language herself, the way a child learns it, by holding up things and repeating what they are out loud. Carriage whip, blinders, singletree, lines. When Merlin, a horse she's riding, balks at carrying her up a hill, Wagenrich digs him sharply with her heel, then gives him the taste of rawhide, a piquant reminder to Merlin of the true terms of their conversation. The mastery the women achieve is real, not notional, the mental and physical domination of another being. As Kimball writes in The Dirty Life, controlling a horse means you're on top, a position of power. For the first time in their lives, the women feel in control. I rise up on the big pasture from the back of a horse, Suzanne McMinn reflects in the closing pages of her memoir. And in my hands, I hold the reins. In mastering the animal, she has mastered herself. Though each memoir ostensibly relates an original story of self-discovery, the sameness of the books complicates their authors' claims of existential authenticity. The title of memoirist Ellen Stimpson's best-selling book, Mud Season: How One Woman's Dream of Moving to Vermont, Raising Children, Chickens, and Sheep, and running the old country store pretty much led to one calamity after another, is representative of the themes and literary sensibilities of memoirs across the genre. The women poke fun at their greenhorn farming ways, marvel at their new Carhartt mud boots, and crack wise about goat and sheep penises. Several recount identical, comical showdowns with mean roosters, whom they vanquish at the chopping block. Bats and bears and skunks. Oh my, reads one chapter title. Calves' heads and black snakes and groundhogs, oh my, reads another in a different book by a different author. Even as the women depict themselves as roughing it, enacting pastoral rituals that people have been doing for thousands of years. They surf the internet, play Farmville on their iPhones, and curl up at night to a Netflix movie and a fine Chablis after a hard day wrangling sheep, milking cows, and cutting off the heads of the sensitive creatures they lovingly depict as their infants and children, mothering babies, then killing them. There have been any number of farming memoirs written by men, including the best-selling The Bucolic Plague by Josh Kilmer Purcell, about a gay couple who leave their jobs in Manhattan to set up an animal farm on an old estate in the country. As in the women's memoirs, the gentlemen farmers portray themselves in a self-deprecating and comedic light, as smug city slickers who get their comeuppance wading in cow dung. Like their female counterparts, too, the men portray their rural experiments as a way to achieve a sense of authenticity and connection to nature. However, there are far fewer farming memoirs by men, and unlike the memoirs by women, the male authors don't couch their farming adventures as cure-alls for depression, romantic disappointment, or career crisis. Nor do they depict animal husbandry as a revelatory exercise in parental caregiving. The first book to popularize the gentlewoman farmer narrative was Barbara Kingsolver's bestseller, Animal, Vegetable, Miracle, a critique of corporate agribusiness, wrapped in a personal account of the Kingsolver family's experiences running a small organic animal farm. Published in 2007, Animal, Vegetable, Miracle was the first bestseller to center maternal and natalist themes in the new discourses of animal husbandry. April 23, my baby's due, Kingsolver scrawls in her calendar, marking the day the chicks she's ordered are to arrive from the hatchery. Our turkeys would be pampered as children, she explains, saying that she has ordered the birds to instruct her daughter in the responsibilities of mothering. Some parents would worry about a daughter taking on maternal responsibility so early in life, but Lily was already experienced, having helped care for chickens at the family's previous home. Kingsolver's approach would subsequently inspire scores of similar farming memoirs by women. Orenstein's The Femivore's Dilemma would appear in the Times just 3 years later. Maternal themes appear in these books too, signaled in the book's cover photographs of the authors smiling in mud boots, clutching chickens, lambs, or baby pigs, infant-like to their gingham-clad chests. We would make babies, Catherine Friend writes in Hit by a Farm, after she and her partner buy a farm in Minnesota to raise sheep. Another author puts a basket of gear and supplies by her back door, like a hospital suitcase for a mother-in-waiting or a midwife, preparing for a midnight delivery. For memoirist Ellen Stimson, the decision to foster a little girl and a little boy, a pair of lambs, fills the author with trepidation because it had been a long time since I had had a baby. As the pregnant animals approach their due dates, the women anxiously take their temperatures and check their cervixes. When the babies are born, the women are over the moon. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, Friend enthuses on birthing day. We'd made a baby boy. Cradling the sturdy little wool baby in her arms, Susan McMinn feels starry-eyed. Pastures in birthing season are described as nurseries and out-of-control daycare centers, while herding lambs is said to resemble a fire drill in a kindergarten. By controlling the bodies of other animals, the women are able to demonstrate superhuman maternal powers. One author writes of her joy in having a baby on my lap, while boasting that her skills progress to the point I can feed 5 babies at once. Slipping out of bed in the small hours of the morning after breastfeeding their own newborns, the women go out and milk cows and goats, yielding brimming vats of milk that would make La Leche League green, or white, with envy. Ordinarily, a nursing mother can produce only a few pints of milk each day. Jenna Wagenrich, however, is soon producing more than 45 gallons of fresh milk each month. "Holy cow," she writes. "Strike that, holy goat. I'm doing it." In a fantasy of limitless fertility, the women produce thousands of eggs and help birth llamas, sheep, cows, alpacas, rabbits, and goats. For memoirists who are single and have longed for children of their own, rearing farmed animals becomes a way to achieve an elusive motherhood. "I had become a single parent raising a goat," Wagenrich writes, recounting how she learned to let down a goat's milk by massaging her teats. The traditional human dependent is of course not the domesticated pig, chicken, or llama, but the human infant. However, that kind of dependent, the sort demanding unwavering parental attention and care, has long been sign and symptom of woman's subordinate social status. So long as women remain solely responsible for bearing and raising children, they remain socially disadvantaged. Having a child is not merely to have a dependent, it is to be dependent. Hence the importance placed by earlier feminists on universal free childcare as a way of freeing women to pursue careers. Today's femivores, however, have gravitated to a new kind of dependent, one that allows them to engage in the pageantry of maternalism, but without the risk of being tied down. These are babies who can be loved and cared for, but also gotten rid of once their company grows tedious. Most of the memoirists want only ersatz children, ones requiring only a simulation of maternal love and responsibility. Casual indifference to the fates of their babies is the norm in the memoirs. When the women aren't killing the animals outright, hence, they're killing them through malign neglect. Animals die left and right on the women's farms, with such frequency that the reader needs a scorecard to keep up. Sheep get crushed to death between bales of hay. Chickens fall between slats of pallets, or get mashed between the side of the feeder box and the wall of the chicken house, or have their necks broken when the women accidentally crush them with heavy objects. One rabbit gets her leg caught in the steel mesh floor and tries to gnaw it off, dislocating her vertebra and paralyzing her from the waist down. Snowstorms on the McCorkindale farm leave behind what the author jokingly calls a very nice dusting of dead chickens when the suffering birds freeze to death. Cows give birth alongside electric fences, incinerating their newborn calves. "Bad things happen," Catherine Friend observes blandly after one ewe gives birth along an electric fence, killing 2 lambs. When she and her partner accidentally get their flock of sheep pregnant out of season, they correct the error by selling them all for slaughter. As more than one memoirist remarks, there's a saying in farming, if you're going to have livestock, you're going to have dead stock. Such pearls are meant to distract the reader from the fact that it is the authors themselves who have placed their vulnerable charges at mortal risk. It is they who will betray their babies in the end, ensuring that not one escapes a violent death. When Kingsolver's chicks arrive from the hatchery, the author at first finds them adorable, recounting how they imprinted on me as mama and rushed happily to greet me wherever I appeared. Kingsolver confesses to feeling like Cruella de Vil for having deceived the young turkeys into thinking that she's their mother, their real one having already been killed, and taken them under her wing for the sole purpose of killing and eating them. Once the chicks mature into young adults and begin exerting their own agency and will, however, Kingsolver no longer wants them around. "Many of us were relieved that year at harvest time," she confesses. Up to the very moment of slaughter, Kingsolver compares her relationship to the birds to that between a mother and her children, a tacit acknowledgement that the violence she is to inflict constitutes an act of betrayal. Moments before delivering the coup de grace using a kill pipe, she has placed the bird's body inside a tube to immobilize her, so that she can then cut her throat. Kingsolver registers the downy softness and a vulnerable heartbeat of the animal whose life she is about to extinguish. "I felt maternal, while at the same time looking straight down the pipe toward the purpose of this enterprise." In Shakespeare's Macbeth, after Lord and Lady Macbeth determine to murder King Duncan and his men, guests under their roof, Lady Macbeth privately begs the spirits to unsex her by damming up the access and passage to remorse. Only by tamping down any compunctious visitings of nature, compassion, can she proceed with her fell purpose. The memoirists similarly suppress any natural stirrings of empathy in order to destroy their young charges, producing scenes in which maternal affection suddenly gives way to violence and unfeeling cruelty. I stroked his warm, warty head. I could feel his heart beating slowly, writes novella Carpenter in Farm City. The education of an urban farmer of Harold, the loving turkey she has raised, seconds before cutting off his head. Catherine Friend, meanwhile, describes how she clung fiercely to this tender animal in my arms, wanting to protect her from whatever dangers lay ahead, except for herself. When an affectionate lamb becomes smitten with Friend, following her around and demanding to be patted on the head, she names him Mr. Playful, gushing to her partner. I feel like kissing him right on his nose. Weeks later, Friend sits in her pickup outside a slaughterhouse, weeping, as Mr. Playful is killed. By suppertime, though, she's right as rain again, sitting down eagerly to dine on the lamb's body. Eating Mr. Playful's savory and incredibly tender flesh is her way of honoring the lamb that died. My italics. Novella Carpenter, ruminating about killing the pigs she's raised, wonders whether the animals are really as intelligent as everyone says they are. Would she end up keeping the beasts as 700-pound pets, or instead melt them down into fat? Of course it would be the latter, she writes. I knew myself well enough by then. A pragmatic farmer, not a soft sentimentalist. Ironically, though Carpenter and other femivores accuse vegans of sentimentality, it is they who engage in sentimental depictions of the animals they kill, treating them not as individuals worthy of respect, but as platforms for their own narcissistic displays of affect. In a conversation with another farmer about killing chickens, Carpenter remarks, "It's solemn," recounting how we both touched our hearts. These sorts of empty sentimental gestures, like Friend crying in her pickup, or the de rigueur ritual of thanking the animal corpse before a meal, recur throughout the memoirs. Sentimentality, a form of thinly disguised bad faith, is not to be confused with genuine sentiment or feeling. As James Baldwin observed in his critique of the white liberal sensibility of Uncle Tom's Cabin, sentimentality, the ostentatious parading of excessive and spurious emotion, is the mark of dishonesty, the inability to feel. The wet eyes of the sentimentalist betray his aversion to experience, his fear of life, his arid heart. And it is always, therefore, the signal of secret and violent inhumanity, the mark of cruelty. Baldwin's observation explains how the sentimentality in these accounts bleeds so easily into sadism. A dark undertow of violence runs beneath the memoirist's narratives, as caring and killing get woven into a lethal maternalism, and infant care dissolves into bloody spectacles of death. In Blood, Bones, and Butter, Gabrielle Hamilton's memoir about becoming a chef, the author confesses that each time she changes diapers on a non-compliant child, she's reminded of trussing chickens and wrangling eels. Hamilton wistfully describes her family's spring lamb roasts during her childhood, when the lambs, with their little crooked sets of teeth and milky eyes, were slaughtered by a local butcher, then skewered onto 10-foot poles made of ash, as her family roasted 4 or 5 of the whole little guys. In a macabre parody of maternal watchfulness, the author writes, "The lambs were arranged over the coals head to toe and head to toe, the way you'd put a bunch of kids having a sleepover to bed. The lullaby for the sleepover is the sound of the lamb's blood as it drips down into the coals with a hypnotic and rhythmic bliss. Hiss, hiss, hiss." Many of the memoirists speak of getting their hands dirty, a euphemism for enacting violence. I had daily intimacy not just with dirt, but with blood, manure, milk, pus. The grease of engines and the grease of animals with innards, writes Kimball in The Dirty Life. Another memoirist observes that most of my story was written in sweat, tears, and even a little blood. And there will be blood. Buckets and buckets of it. Blood pouring out of the torn tracheas of cows, blood gushing out of the throats of thrashing pigs caught in giant buckets. Perhaps, confesses Catherine Friend, even more blood than I was comfortable with. With despotic fury, the women stab rabbits, dismember deer, and roam the barnyard lopping off heads. Farms become abattoirs, cemeteries killing fields. One memoirist traps a raccoon, then shoots him with a rifle as he cowers in a cage. Wow, she writes. I felt strange. I just killed an animal. I felt good and bad all at the same time. But the truth is, she feels very good. Though the women wonder whether they'll be tough enough when the moment of truth comes, they prove eager and even impatient to kill. When journalist cum hunter Lily McCullough kills her first animal with a well-placed headshot, a clean, perfect kill of a pheasant in a canned hunt, the animals are raised in captivity, then released before the hunters in a confined space to be shot. She experiences euphoria. Driving home, she recounts, I roll down the windows, crank up the radio, and sing at the top of my lungs. Like a man boasting of having deflowered his first virgin, the author writes that no other kill evokes such pure elation as my first. McCullough, who compares herself to a modern-day Diana the Huntress, soon graduates from killing birds and small mammals to slaying larger animals. Her moment of arrival comes the day she finds herself kneeling before a bull elk, up to my shoulders in blood, drenched in blood and laughing at her earlier squeamishness. For McCullough and the other memoirists, shedding the blood of animals becomes a way to reenact earlier rituals of maturation, loss of childlike innocence with the adult knowledge that death is the substance of life. In a kind of reverse transubstantiation, real blood gets transformed into something metaphysical, an aesthetic of the sublime and an authentic self. In Farm City, named one of the top 10 books of 2009 by Dwight Gardner, daily book critic for the New York Times, Novella Carpenter invokes the rite of menses when, renouncing her former vegetarianism, she throws out her Moosewood cookbook and replaces it with the Encyclopedia of Country Living, an instruction manual on DIY slaughter. After her first kill, Carpenter reports, the book becomes marked with blood. A leading force in locavore politics in the San Francisco Bay Area, Carpenter is an especially avid killer, someone who enjoys seeing animals die. Of the first pigs she has raised, Carpenter writes, I was going to have to kill one of Simon's babies. Yeah, I gotta find someone to execute those fuckers. She hires a female butcher named Sheila to do the deed, telling her, I really want to see the pigs die. Later, when she learns in a phone call that Sheila has gone ahead and killed the animals without her being there, Carpenter is so infuriated that she slams down the receiver and screams, Cunt! Seeing the dead pigs' bodies for the first time, she impulsively reaches over to a pig's severed head and scoops its raw brains into her mouth, pronouncing them delicious. In another passage, Carpenter boasts of the bloody revenge she enacts on a possum who's made his way into the poultry enclosure one night. Recalling the cuteness of my ducks and the goose who would rest her head in my lap, Carpenter takes a shovel and brings it down on the opossum's neck, thrusting repeatedly until his head rolls off. Caught up in protecting my babies, she quips, I had become a savage. Her fierce determination to protect her babies is nowhere in evidence weeks later, though when she carries a trusting white duck into her house, places him in the bathtub, and decapitates him with a pruner. He quacked and swam around for a few minutes. I merely squeezed the loppers shut. The duck went from being a happy camper to being a headless camper. I plucked and eviscerated him outside on a table. Flippant passages like these, in which the memoirists mock their victims, give the lie to the author's claims to love and respect animals. Catherine Friend finds it amusing when a lamb strays against an electric fence and receives an 8,000-volt shock, a voltage so high that it burns a hole in a leather glove, causing him to shoot straight up in the air and to run crying to his mother as the other lambs scatter in panic. When a new lamb is born on Friend's farm, she and her partner steal it from its mother in order to do things to it. We sneak up to a pair of sleeping twins and each pick one up. The ewe no longer sees her babies on the ground and panics. Similar heartbreaking scenes of traumatized sheep and cows returning day after day to the place where they last saw their baby, sniffing the ground and lowing in distress, can be found in many of the memoirs, their authors betraying not the least sympathy for their victims, let alone remorse for their cruelty. The women joke about the impending doom of their victims, finding humor in their very guilelessness and vulnerability. Wagenrich, observing that the pig she has raised will soon die in the same place where she has spent the last 3 months sleeping and eating, remarks, "It will surprise the hell out of her." And it does. On the fateful morning, as Wagenrich reaches down to scratch the pig's ear, the pig turns and looks at her curiously, wagging her little curled tail and making gentle noises. "I'm proud of this pig," Wagenrich writes. Soon 3 men arrive in a truck, seize the trusting animal, slash her throat and carve her body up into slabs. Wagenrich sticks around to watch. "It's her way of taking responsibility," she writes. "I need to be there," she says, "to bear witness to the whole process, from holding a piglet in a dog crate squealing in my arms, to the day its head lies on a snowbank." Romancing the knife. Food is often tied to sex in human culture, and a number of the memoirists find ways to link the killing or eating of animals to eroticism. "This gravy makes my nipples hard," murmurs the young wife of a Navy officer after sampling a gravy made from a turkey. Novella Carpenter, meanwhile, describes herself as dizzy with desire at the sight of a stack of bacon, confessing to the sin of pork lust. For many of the women, pleasure in killing animals gets bound up with their romantic attachments to men. "Don't you have to tie off the anus and penis first?" Lily McCallow's husband lovingly reminds her as the couple kneel together before the warm body of an elk. Moments before this pillow talk, the couple have been crawling together through the muck of a damp forest, chasing down the mortally wounded elk McCallow has shot through the heart. Later, over dinner, the lovers raise glasses of wine in a simple toast, loaded with thanks to our elk. One elk, one kill, one heart. For many memoirists, the best way to win over a man is to strike down an animal. Susan McMinn describes killing chickens as the last new thing she and her lover did before breaking up, a kind of fitting punctuation to our life together. For Kristen Kimball, killing and eviscerating a pig is the first activity she shares with Mark, a handsome young farmer she interviews for an article. Kimball finds that she is not disgusted, but enlivened by the experience of killing, so much so that the next morning she finds herself padding barefoot around Mark's kitchen, eating his organic sausages, after sleeping with him the night before. The couple grows closer with every assassination. "Mark and I move through the steps of slaughter gracefully, a coordinated team of two," Kimball writes. "Mark handed me the gun, I handed him the knife." Together, the couple sneak up on a cow they've named Kathleen, whom they find grazing quietly in a field. They put a bullet in her head, then slash open her throat so that her hot blood poured out on the grass. All of this violence suggests nothing so much as a wish on the part of the women to be accepted as co-equals in the death cult of patriarchy. In male-dominated societies, sexual desire is sometimes blurred with a desire to inflict suffering, an impulse seen, for example, in violent pornography. For each aspect of eros, observes feminist theorist Nancy Hartsock, the centrality of hostility, the wish to do harm, marks a fascination with death, the death of the other as a separate being, the denial of one's own body in order to deny one's mortality, and the recasting even of reproduction as death. These impulses, deeply rooted in masculine culture, have only been amplified under conditions of advanced capitalism where Herbert Marcuse once noted, "Constructive and destructive achievements, work for life and work for death, procreating and killing, get blurred together." George Orwell observed that false reconciliation of opposites, freedom as slavery, war as peace, etc., is a characteristic of totalitarianism. Today we find similar attempts to reconcile opposites in the new omnivorism, as killing animals gets conflated with caring for them, and death is blurred with life. Conflation of death and life sometimes even takes the form of the author's own fantasies of self-destruction. In her best-selling book, The Ethical Meat Handbook, Meredith Lee, a prominent carnivore in North Carolina who runs do-it-yourself slaughter workshops, goes so far as to imagine her own murder. After a pleasurable day spent slaying animals on her farm, Lee writes, "We separate hearts and heads, we roll fleeces for later washing and tanning. We slaughter 2 more lambs, Maybelle and Whiteface. We share silence and sadness each time. Each time I feel my breathing and I feel gratitude for precious life as well as for suffering. I think I could stand to die here. Here in this pasture under these mountains, this sky. If when my time comes, someone lays me down in green grass and soothes my body, and someone I love then lovingly cuts my throat, and my blood runs into the grass and fertilizes the soil, and my body is used for food and necessity, I could handle that." Lee offers this dissociative fantasy as a sign of her supposed connection to animals and nature. In reality, it signifies contempt for animals and renunciation of the life principle. Of the hundreds of animals Lee kills, none will be given the opportunity to choose the place, the time, or the means of their deaths. The author's supposed gesture of solidarity with her victims collapses into grotesque sentimentalism, a defense against her own aggression. Hunger Games. In 1974, a young chef at a feminist food collective in Ithaca named Moosewood published a new book of vegetarian recipes. The Moosewood cookbook soon became one of the most popular cookbooks of all time, and the name of its author, Molly Katzen, became synonymous with vegetarianism. In 2017, however, Katzen announced that she had started eating meat again. "For about 30 years I didn't eat meat at all, just a bite of fish every once in a while, and always some dairy," Katzen told an interviewer with Food and Wine magazine. "Lately I've been eating a little meat. People say, 'Ha ha, Molly Katzen is eating steak.' But now that cleaner, naturally fed meat is available, it's a great option for anyone who's looking to complete his diet." Katzen now claimed to have been misunderstood all those years. She'd never said that she didn't want people to eat meat. She'd only wanted to supply possibilities that were low on the food chain. The heroine of vegetarians everywhere now mocked them. "For people who are against eating meat because it's wrong or offensive to eat animals," Katzen said, "even the cleanest grass-fed beef won't be good enough." Katzen's about-face represented more than a change in diet. It was the repudiation of a movement and a moment when many Americans, particularly women, had become open to a new way of relating to food and to animals. How had the nation gone from the feminist vegetarian Moosewood to the spectacle of women hunting moose in the woods? While women have been drawn to animal husbandry for many of the same reasons that men have, such as a longing for a more authentic relation to nature and to the sources of our food, femivorism has specific features all its own, as a cultural response to the contradictory demands on women in the 21st century. We have seen that some femivores explicitly describe their domination of animals as feminist. Whether one agrees with that characterization, however, will depend on how one construes the history and meaning of feminism, and whether one finds oneself satisfied with a conception of women's progress that emphasizes their formal rather than substantive equality with men. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, radical feminists sought not merely formal parity with men, but a broader transformation of patriarchal norms and institutions, including an end to militarism, imperialism, racism, and rape culture. As the feminist poet and essayist Adrienne Rich wrote in Toward a Woman-Centered University, 1973-1974, the question facing women wasn't merely whether they should be equal participants in society alongside men, but whether this male-created, male-dominated structure is really capable of serving the humanism and freedom it professes. Rich and other radical feminists argued that it was not, and that patriarchal societies' suicidal obsession with power and technology was incompatible with general liberation and a just society. True women's liberation thus implied the creation of a new society, based on principles of universal freedom and nonviolence. It was this same vision of a just world that ecofeminists like Marty Keel and Unestra King would later lay claim to in their work, highlighting human oppression of animals as one of the most destructive features of patriarchal society. The high-water mark of these efforts was Carol Adams's book, The Sexual Politics of Meat. By the time Adams's book appeared in 1990, however, the women's movement had been in decline for years, and feminist interest in vegetarianism had waned along with it. With the election of President Ronald Reagan in 1980, a period of broad political reaction had set in, transforming the political and cultural landscape and leading to a retrenchment of traditional gender norms. Liberal feminism, oriented around winning formal parity with men, now came into ascendancy. More radical figures in the movement, those who had questioned the underlying values of the patriarchal system, including speciesism, were eclipsed. Over time, mainstream feminism moved ever further away from environmentalism, vegetarianism, and animal rights. By the 1990s, women had gained entry into previously closed professions and had won important legal victories for reproductive rights and against discrimination in the workplace. However, despite these and other advances, women remained socially subordinate to men. Women remained responsible for the bulk of domestic labor and child-rearing. They were still paid less than their male counterparts, and they remained as susceptible as before to male sexual assault. For white middle-class and upper-class women in particular, the group that had arguably gained the most from post-70s feminist reform, equality had come to seem tantalizingly close, but also agonizingly out of reach. As Susan Faludi observed in Backlash, The Undeclared War Against American Women, 1991, behind this celebration of the American woman's victory, behind the news, cheerfully and endlessly repeated, that the struggle for women's rights is won, another message flashes. You may be free and equal now, it says to women, but you have never been more miserable. This contradiction between the promise of gender equality on the one hand and women's continuing status as the social subordinates of men, on the other, created the cultural opening for femivorism, a regressive project in which some middle-class white women, partly under the mantle of liberal feminism, have channeled their frustration and rage over the unfinished business of sexual equality into animal husbandry and other forms of animal harm. It is no accident that the phenomenon arose during a period of patriarchal retrenchment and neoliberal austerity, during the rollback of women's rights, and a cultural retreat into various localisms that came at the expense of broader civic engagement. The influx of women into animal pastoralism siphoned off some women's energies into a depoliticized movement, one that substituted rural domesticity for a more robust conception of feminist struggle. Before she began running an animal farm, Kristen Kimball confesses, "The word home could make me cry because I wanted one, with a man, a house, the smell of cut grass, sheets on a line, a child running through a sprinkler." After forsaking professional lives in the city, she and other post-feminist pioneers set furiously to work canning, preserving, pickling, gardening, knitting, sewing, quilting, baking, and making homemade jerky, transforming themselves into domestic superheroes. As more than one memoirist describes herself, in a ferocious return to stereotypically feminine activities, now improbably recast as tactics of empowerment. Few women today, however, welcome the idea of a complete return to domestic life. Some countervailing demonstration of women's power within the domestic sphere is therefore needed to paper over the contradiction between the femivores' avowed quests for authenticity and independence, on the one hand, and their socially prescribed longings to fulfill traditional gender roles, on the other. And domination over animals has provided it. In the femivore memoirs, violence against animals serves as a kind of psychic ballast, keeping the women from sinking entirely under what would otherwise be merely another form of conventional domesticity. By mothering animals, then killing them. The women have found a way to square the circle of a new femininity that demands that women be both vulnerable and strong, domesticated and self-sufficient. By raising pigs and sheep, then bearing eager witness to their deaths, the women are able to exhibit traditional caring behavior while also demonstrating the toughness and ruthlessness we stereotypically associate with men. Having spent their lives in a world centered around men and their brutal deeds, women can now claim a piece of the action for themselves. Hence the swagger, as Jessica Applestone, co-owner of Flesher's Grass-Fed and Organic Meats, calls it, among women taking her butchering class for the first time. There's a macho performal sick nature that some of these people crave, she says. And what better a performance than the blood and guts of butchery? Tellingly, many of the memoirists seek out male approbation rather than meaningful connections with other women. Many recount the ritual of learning to wield a gun, a potent symbol of masculine power that allows them to claim a transgressive status, while nonetheless engaging in a practice that keeps them safely within the bounds of existing patriarchal norms. I ran my hand over the smooth, dark wood of the stock and shivered, Kimball writes, caressing her first rifle. Hand me a bow and arrow or a rifle and it makes sense, Wagenrich confesses. Fielding a gun for the first time, Catherine Friend thinks, gosh, this is fun. Hand me more bullets. After considering different weapons, Friend settles on an air pistol for killing groundhogs and other pests on her farm. We're going to shoot those SOBs, a woman staying with her remarks. I yearned for more space, more breathing room, Friend writes, and how better to carve out a little Lebensraum in the wilderness than with a blazing firearm. Soon the hills around the memoirist's farms are alive with the sounds of gunfire, as the farms and their surrounds get transformed into free-fire zones for killing deer, possums, pigeons, squirrels, and any other living being hapless enough to wander across the women's defense perimeter in search of food, shelter, or a mate. Memoirists who have described themselves as liberals suddenly reveal a patriotic fascination with all things military. I've always fantasized about being one of those Navy SEALs, Special Forces, or Delta Force dudes. I think it would be a blast, McCorkindale writes. I begin to understand why hunting is often compared to war, McCullough confesses. Like soldiers victorious in battle, she and the other women keep tokens of their victims' bodies, feathers, tails, teeth, etc. Susan McMinn nails the tail of the raccoon she's killed to her front porch as a warning to other pests, much as colonial officials once impaled the heads of defeated native warriors on poles at the town gate. Even the memoirist's insatiable hunger for meat and blood as enlivening foods, a recurring theme in many of the accounts, suggests nothing so much as a sublimated desire to participate in society as the true equals of men. Many memoirists describe themselves as former vegetarians or vegans whose cravings for flesh supposedly overwhelmed them. Of her time as a vegetarian, Kristen Kimball writes, there was something about it, something more primal, a kind of craving, my body yelling, eat that, I need it. McCullough confesses, when I don't eat meat for a few weeks, I start to crave a hamburger as a vampire does blood. There is poignancy to such accounts, unfolding as they do against the backdrop of a culture obsessed with food and with women's relationship to it. Vegans are familiar with the pathological vegan, usually a woman, who throws herself into veganism to force herself into being thinner. The converted femivores appear to have exchanged one pathological relationship to food for another. Temple of the Abattoir. The myth that animals can be raised and killed humanely, and with compassion, has today been adopted not only by organic farmers and locavores, but also by the world's largest meat packers. Smithfield, owned by the WH Group in China, the world's largest killer of pigs, advertises itself as the world's leader in animal care, while Tyson Foods, the world's biggest killer of chickens, boasts that its animal well-being program promotes the health, safety, and well-being of the animals. In this context, femivorism, with its rhetoric of womanly care, has come to serve as a strategic bridge between smaller-scale animal agriculture and factory farming. Judith Capper, a self-proclaimed livestock sustainability consultant to the U.S. cattle industry, invokes her femininity to legitimate factory farming. In a blog entry entitled, "Do Moms Have Instant Beef Credibility?" Capper links stories of women as nurturing mothers and domestic providers to the caring work of industrialized animal agriculture, noting that women who have children are trusted by female consumers more than the traditional scientific image of an older man in a white lab coat. Capper urges male ranchers to ask their wife, girlfriend, daughter, mother, granddaughter, or niece to let the female consumer know why beef is a great choice for our families, and why we spend time caring for baby calves almost as if they are our own children. Only women can make that female-female connection that, like it or not, does promote an instant degree of trust. At a meeting of the International Livestock Conference, one prominent male cattle lobbyist praised Capper for helping to improve the image of beef sustainability, noting that Jude Capper is credible because she is female, and suggesting that Capper would soon become even more credible when she has children of her own. Recounting the lobbyist's praise later on her blog, Capper revealed that she was 7 months pregnant. "I am gaining credibility by the day, pound by pound." Literally. With her new baby bump, she would have even more opportunities for conversations about the importance of beef in pregnancy nutrition. While Capper is not widely known outside the beef industry, the same cannot be said of animal behaviorist and meat industry consultant Temple Grandin, the most consequential figure in the feminine washing of mass violence against animals. Grandin first rose to celebrity in the 1990s on the basis of her unsubstantiated claim that her autism has imbued her with a mystical ability to know what other animals are thinking and feeling. Leveraging these supposed powers of insight, Grandin has built a lucrative career helping meat companies slaughter animals more efficiently and humanely by eliminating sensorial clues that might otherwise tip off cows, sheep, and pigs that they are facing imminent death. That Grandin should be universally praised for caring about animals tells us everything we might care to know about society's need to justify its murderous impulses. In a rational order, an obsession with designing means to effect mass killing would be seen as perverse, if not as anathema to the proper values of society. Against the backdrop of a pathological society, however, a woman who professes to care so much for animals that she has devoted her life to helping millions of them go uncomplainingly to their doom is held up instead as an exemplary figure. In 2009, Encyclopedia Britannica published an article entitled, "We Salute Temple Grandin, a Hero for Animals." And in 2010, Time magazine named Grandin one of the 100 most influential people of the year. The same year, NPR ran a story entitled, "Temple Grandin, a Life Devoted to Animals," and HBO aired a hagiographic biopic, Temple Grandin, starring the glamorous actress Claire Danes. In 2013, the Museum of Modern Art in New York preposterously described Grandin as an animal rights activist, while praising one of Grandin's design concepts, a kill chute designed to pacify and reassure animals as they approached their deaths at the slaughterhouse. If Grandin hadn't existed, the culture would have had to create her, but in a sense it did. Only with the waning of a more substantive feminist politics could causing harm to animals come to be mistaken for genuine women's liberation. Waging war on animals is the continuation of post-feminist politics by other means, a way for some women to work through the conflictual nature of 21st century femininity, without however challenging the prerogatives or values of men. Today's real-life Dianas and Katnisses may not be able to shatter the corporate glass ceiling or to send conservative state legislators scattering for cover before they can close another abortion clinic, but they can make some deer or pig pay. But sticking pigs is not the same as sticking it to the man. With its false pieties of respect for animals and its love of guns, knives, and blood, Femivorism signifies a maladaptive response to women's subordination, a reactionary stance allied with some of the most destructive features of our patriarchal culture, their kindness toward each other. Reading these disturbing memoirs, it is easy to forget that most vegans are women, as are many leading figures in animal advocacy. Women like Brenda Sanders, whose Afro-Vegan Society is doing extraordinary community organizing about racism, veganism, and health in the black neighborhoods of Baltimore. Or Patrice Jones, the director of Vine Sanctuary, who tried to save Bill and Lou, the Green Mountain College oxen. Or Jenny Brown, co-founder of Woodstock Animal Sanctuary, who drew on her own experiences as a disabled woman to develop prosthetics for rescued animals maimed and crippled in the industrialized agriculture system, restoring them to mobility and an active life. These and many other courageous women I might name have modeled genuine care and respect for animals by rescuing them from slaughterhouses, running sanctuaries, and educating the public about the true nature of animal agriculture. There are many caring men, too, who have dedicated their lives to animal advocacy. Men like Robert Grillo, director of Free from Harm, and the British animal advocate Kim Stallwood. However, it isn't these men and women being profiled by the media or being awarded handsome book contracts with the top presses. Only those who exploit and kill animals are deemed worthy of public interest. It was not so very long ago, however, that more justice-oriented perspectives on animals could still be found in the media. In 1990, on the 20th anniversary of Kate Millett's pathbreaking book, Sexual Politics, Simon and Schuster published Millett's memoir, The Looney Bin Trip, about her struggle with a bipolar disorder while living in a women's collective on a former working farm in New York. Millett's account of visiting a rural horse auction reminds us that there are more ethical and more meaningfully feminist ways for us to think about our relationship with other animals, besides doing violence to them. Millett arrives at the auction expecting the pleasant atmosphere of a country fair. Instead, she finds herself confronted by a spectacle of ritualized humiliation and violence. Everyone at the auction, except for Millett and the friend she has gone with, are men. It turns out that the horses and ponies are there not to be sold as pets, as Millett had thought, but to be auctioned off by the pound to be killed for dog food. A tangible climate of fear pervades the arena as the animals sense death in the air. The horses are neighing in fright, and a tiny pony is crying out in small cries. As the auction gets underway, men poke and prod the terrified animals, forcing them around the viewing ring. It is not anger they feel, any more than deportees in boxcars or behind barbed wire. It's gone way beyond anger, Millett writes. Their situation is too desperate, too inferiorized for anger that implies some peer relationship, a testing of forces that are matched. They are no match for Luther's auction, not even hundreds of them. The shocking thought comes to her that these creatures are like slaves, bought and sold to whomever and wherever, without control over any part of their destiny. Seized by pity and emboldened by a sudden upswing in her mood disorder, Millett throws herself into the bidding, determined to save as many animals as she can. She succeeds in saving 3, a small pony and 2 horses. The larger horse, a discard from a summer children's riding camp, she names Big Jim. "You don't condescend to this animal," she writes. "The pony is like a kid. This is an adult male, awesome, proud, powerful." After the auction, Millett returns to the farm to await the animal's arrival. When the transport truck finally arrives, she helps each one down the ramp. Finally, it's Big Jim's turn. After leading him down, Millett begins walking him slowly towards the stalls, away from the field where the other horses are. Suddenly, the other horses whinny from the field, and Big Jim whinnies back. The calls are imperious, urgent, powerful, Millett writes. They obliterate people as they call from kind to kind. How eager they are to claim him and how entirely the need of them takes over the big horse. Big Jim begins irresistibly pulling Millett towards the other horses, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Now Millett has to run to keep up with him. Then I am only something impeding him, she says. Take it easy, you're scaring me, I say to him, and he actually slows down a bit. But he cannot contain himself, cannot resist, and we take the road to the gate of the field in far too much of a hurry for me. As Millet throws open the gate of the corral, Big Jim rushes past her. It is a passion, what they have toward each other, the urgency of that neighing. It must be more than they feel for humans except in rare cases. And these refugees must have everything to tell each other, to heal each other of death, having nearly died in the auction barns and escaped here. But the remarkable thing is their kindness toward each other, the courtesy, one almost wants to say, of their society. The way they have paired off, Pony with Pony and the gray horse with the Palomino, and now Jim with Big Molly, the mare who is boarding with us, a neurotic who chews on wood and is forced to wear a restraining band. Jim has gallantly taken on this difficult personality, and they are from the first inseparable. I think, going back to the pond, what a very nice fellow he is, this horse, and how charitable they are toward each other as beings. At the moment when Big Jim begins to pull away from her, Millet realizes what she feared but already knew, which is that Big Jim is mysterious and of himself, and will not always do what I want. Thank me for keeping his life, and hold me in gratitude. The epiphany comes to her that Big Jim is a being with his own needs and interests, separate from hers, and that there will always be this distance of awe between us, the unknown across species. Rather than fight this uncomfortable realization, Millet allows herself to be humbled by it. Surrendering her need to control Big Jim, she finds herself existentially lighter, relieved of the burden of her dominion. It is a remarkable passage. One of the outstanding feminist theorists of the 20th century, Millet models a quite different way of relating to animals than we have seen elsewhere in this chapter and in this book, where malignant narcissism, sentimentality, and bad faith in men and women alike destroy any possibility of genuine communion with other beings, and where animals assume the form only of remote figures, glimpsed callously from an unbridgeable distance. Hairy Lyme disease. In the film The Third Man, starring Joseph Cotten and Orson Welles, an American named Holly Martins Cotten travels to occupied Vienna at the end of the Second World War to take a job working with his friend, Harry Lyme Wells, only to learn that his friend is dead, having been killed by a car the day before. In a plot twist, spoiler alert, Martins learns that Lyme has staged his own death to avoid responsibility for a crime. During the war, he knowingly sold contaminated penicillin to a hospital, causing the agonizing deaths of many children. The two men agree to meet at an amusement park atop a giant Ferris wheel. As their gondola lifts them high into the air, Martins confronts his friend over his terrible crime. However, Lyme only smiles. Gesturing matter-of-factly at the tiny figures on the ground far beneath them, he says genially, "Look down there. Would you really feel any pity if one of those dots stopped moving forever?" Gazing on a pasture of grazing cows on a ranch in South Dakota, Michael Pollan similarly describes seeing not individual beings, but perambulating black dots. From this black sea of bovinity, as he terms it, Pollan selects one dot, an Angus steer labeled 534, and arranges to have him transported to a feedlot in Kansas. Later, once fattened, the cow will be killed and carved up into meat. Pollan travels to South Dakota and Kansas to make these elaborate arrangements so that he can later write about his experiences in print. The cow he buys is merely an object to be manipulated and destroyed for his literary purposes. Glimpsed remotely or from a great height, every individual appears insignificant, a speck among other specks. The result is a total collapse of moral perspective. We succumb to hairy Lyme disease, so to say, when we lose sight of others as unique, vulnerable someones, worthy of our solicitude and compassion, seeing them only as interchangeable objects to be manipulated or even destroyed at our caprice. In its symptomology, The condition most resembles the set of character traits we associate with antisocial personality disorders like psychopathy. Psychopathy is characterized by shallow emotions, an inability to empathize with others, and a lack of remorse or guilt after inflicting harm on others. Psychopaths are often intelligent and socially at ease, even charming, owing to their fearlessness and supreme lack of self-doubt. Though psychopaths are unable to feel many emotions, they are often adept at observing and mirroring the feelings of others, making them master manipulators. Psychopaths don't feel they should be constrained by the moral realm. Rather, they treat the world as a completely open field of action, but for themselves alone. Ethical constraints, in short, are for little people. Though few psychopaths become murderers, the inability of psychopaths to empathize with others, coupled with their manipulative outlook and utter lack of moral inhibitions, make them potentially dangerous. While psychopaths don't generally go out of their way to harm others, neither do they respond the way ordinary people do when encountering others in distress. And when they do choose to harm others, they are incapable of feeling remorse or taking responsibility for their actions. Hence Harry Lime's reaction when Martins confronts him on the Ferris wheel, bemused indifference. Though we think of psychopathy as something exotic or rare, the stuff of horror films and frightening headlines, researchers have discovered the disorder to be more widespread than once thought. Furthermore, every quality that researchers identify with psychopathy, including impaired empathy, sympathy, guilt, remorse, shame, and love, can readily be observed in our own collective behavior towards other animals. While most people are able to empathize with some animals, that empathy is selective and typically doesn't extend to the animals we exploit. Violence against non-humans is not only sanctioned by society, but encouraged and monetized. We kill hundreds of billions of sea and land animals each year without feeling remorse or guilt. We even believe that we have a right to our violence, so much so that should an angry vegan question the desirability of these arrangements, we feel indignant. The animals we exploit are merely perambulating dots, things whose lives, interests, and needs have no significance beyond the uses we might make of them. Ours is a society of hairy limes, empathy as a way of knowing others. The most characteristic feature of hairy lime disease is an absence of empathy. Empathy is not so much a feeling as a mode of perception and knowing, a sixth sense rooted in our bodies that provides us access to the internal states, feelings, and perspectives of others. Embracing a distraught friend after the sudden death of her spouse, we find ourselves shedding tears, too. When our child forgets his lines in the school play, we feel his embarrassment, as though it were us up on stage. It is empathy that enables us to know when our baby's diaper needs changing, and whether our friend is really doing fine, or is only saying so. Used in conjunction with reason and our moral imaginations, empathy enables us to feel our way into the experiences even of those distant from us, such as strangers from another culture or historical era, as when we see a news story about a family of refugees drowned at sea, or read a historical account of an enslaved mother's grief as her children are taken from her at an auction. Empathy can also provide us access to the subjective experiences of other animals. To illustrate this point, I would ask you to go to my author's website, www.johnsanbonmatsu.com, where I have posted videos in cognitive ethology or the study of animal minds. Look for the footage of a group of donkeys at the Ezelschoof Sanctuary in Barl-Nassau, in the Netherlands. In the short video, 2 minutes long, we see 7 or 8 donkeys approach the body of a dead donkey lying on a blue plastic tarp. The donkeys crowd around their dead friend, braying and wailing as they investigate his body, before suddenly lapsing into silence. One lets out a high-pitched cry, while another tugs at his face with his teeth, and others paw at their friend with their hooves, trying to revive him. On the periphery of the tarp, the sanctuary staff look on in grief, weeping. We, too, though watching this scene from a temporal and spatial distance, find ourselves deeply affected by the donkey's grief. Though being a human and being a donkey are very different ways of being in the world, we and donkeys participate in a shared life world, or structure of experience. Feelings and moods are contagious, even across the boundary of species. When I show this video in class, my students often express surprise that donkeys are capable of human-like feelings. However, the donkeys are no more human-like in their expressions of grief than we are donkey-like in ours. The limbic system, the part of our brains responsible for our emotions and behavior, consisting chiefly of the amygdala and hippocampus, is among the oldest regions of the proto-mammalian brain, dating back some 150 million years. Long before the earliest hominids, other species were living emotionally vivid lives. We are thus latecomers to empathy. So fundamental is empathy to human social life that the philosopher and psychoanalyst Edith Stein believed it to be the glue that makes possible our relations with one another. Our ability to empathize with others may even be a precondition for society itself, for the experiences of community, belonging, mutuality, and love that make life worth living. It follows that the suppression of this capacity is likely to be injurious to social and moral life. For if I cannot feel my way into your experiences, then I may also feel no emotional disinhibition against manipulating or harming you. In Philip K. Dick's science fiction novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Fugitive replicants, intelligent beings bioengineered to serve as slaves for humans on colonized planets, are hunted down by a policeman named Deckard. Replicants are human in every way but one. They lack empathy. The only way for an investigator to identify a replicant, therefore, is to administer a Voight-Kampff test to register their emotional responses to signs of distress in others. In Blade Runner, the film version of the novel, a suspected replicant is presented with the hypothetical scenario of encountering a tortoise lying on its back, its belly baking in the hot sun, beating its legs trying to turn itself over. The replicant, though, has no idea what is expected of him. Having nothing to gain personally from helping the tortoise, it doesn't occur to him to turn him over. Realizing that he isn't going to pass the test, he murders his interviewer. Most of us would pass the Voight-Kampff test without difficulty. When we see a vulnerable someone in danger or distress, like a struggling bird tangled in a fishing line or a child running into traffic, we feel spontaneous concern for their well-being. That emotional response can then become the basis of moral deliberation and action. After emotionally registering the need of the other, that is, we can then use reason to decide what, if anything, is the appropriate thing to do about it. Psychopaths, though, respond quite differently to the distress of others. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas described the face of the other as the basis of moral life. Seeing the vulnerability of the other's naked face before us, we feel responsible for the other's well-being. But the situation is quite otherwise for the antisocial personality. Nothing indeed more sharply sets the psychopath or sociopath apart from ordinary people as their response to vulnerability. For them, weakness and vulnerability elicit contempt or aggression, not sympathy. In one interview, a woman diagnosed with psychopathy recounts an episode in which she came across a tiny baby possum drowning in a pool where she was to give a swimming lesson. The possum was struggling to try to get out of the pool, and I thought, oh, baby opossum must have fallen in the pool in the night or in the early morning. But the animal's desperation elicits no emotional response in her. So after concluding that there is no advantage to be gained in rescuing the possum, she drowns him with a hose. I never have really felt anything for animals, she remarks with a smile. I've never had a pet or felt like a connection to animals, she tells the interviewer. Psychopaths are perfectly able to recognize their distress and vulnerability of others. They are just indifferent to it. People with antisocial personality disorders treat distressed humans and non-humans with equal callousness. Not only do many serial killers compare the butchering of humans to the butchering of animals, sometimes the behaviors even overlap, as in the case of Canadian pig farmer Robert Picton, who tortured, killed, and cannibalized at least 26 women, burying their remains on his hog farm, where he also killed thousands of pigs. Most serial killers torture and kill non-human animals while children, before growing up to murder humans. So normalized is violence against animals in our culture, however, that it isn't always easy to distinguish a child's ordinary cruelty towards animals from the kind of behavior indicative of a budding psychopath. When I myself was a boy, it pains me to say, I killed insects with wanton abandon. I swatted flies, sprayed raid on wasps, and crushed spiders underfoot. For the colonies of ants who lived in our front lawn, meanwhile, I cultivated special malice. The ants were merely living their own lives, fulfilling their own purposes, and they posed no threat to anyone, least of all to me. Yet I killed them by the hundreds, and I did so in a way calculated to cause them suffering. I killed them not in passion or anger, but with the cool detachment of a behaviorist. I knew that after the ants had withered under my blows, scrambling back inside their burrow to safety, they would eventually venture out again, slowly and cautiously. Having observed their psychology, I would win back their trust in order to betray them again. Forensic psychologist Gwyneth's Head observes that individuals with psychopathy are often not merely indifferent to others' distress, but have a positive emotional response to it. Vulnerability, in short, can be a goad to violence. This sadly was true in my case. It was the ants' very vulnerability that attracted me. Simply, I had singled out the ants because they were even more vulnerable than I was. Only years later did I come to understand that my violence towards the ants was displaced aggression, a way of dealing with the bullying and trauma I experienced as a child. My mode of address to the ants was unmistakably antisocial, though I had great affection for other animals and would never have harmed them. Its Head compares the mentality of psychopaths to that of hunters. In both cases, the perpetrators seek out and target those that will not be protected or cannot protect themselves, those who are weaker and more vulnerable. Both take pleasure in hurting others and exerting control over weaker beings. Like psychopaths, hunters are often skilled at reading the behavior of their victims. They may have a sense of what their prey is thinking, which avenues of escape they may revert to, and so on, while nonetheless being incapable of feeling their way into their experiences. Hunters can thus kill again and again, causing terror and agony to their victims, without experiencing anything but satisfaction. In The Omnivore's Dilemma, Michael Pollan recounts joining a group of friends to ambush a community of mother pigs quietly foraging together with their babies in the woods. Pollan shoots one of the pigs as she tries to flee, shattering her skull and leaving her piglets to starve. Afterwards, he describes feeling pride, relief, and gratitude. The one emotion, though, that he expected to feel but did not feel, he confesses, was remorse or even ambivalence. Instead, he felt absolutely terrific, unambiguously happy. Pollan describes a photo taken of him at the time, kneeling on the ground behind a pig the side of whose head has erupted in blood that is spreading like a river delta. The hunter's rifle is angled just so across his chest. One proprietary hand rests on the dead animal's broad flank. Meanwhile, the author himself is looking into the camera with an expression of unbounded pride, wearing a big shit-eating grin. Had Pollan instead stalked and killed a Labrador retriever, then boasted in print about his unbounded pride, posing beside the dog's still warm body, the blood spreading like a river delta from her exploded head, readers would have been repulsed and likely seen the author as a moral monster. Owing to our society's unjustified contempt for pigs, however, Pollan's pleasure in killing only lent him credibility in the eyes of his readers. Even though there is no ethical difference between killing a pig in the woods and shooting a dog in one's neighborhood, leaving aside the harm done indirectly to the dog's human companion, only social convention and prejudice lead us to hold the one act admirable and the other repugnant. Occasionally, hunters kill dogs by accident, mistaking them for some other killable canine species. In such moments, the moral incoherence of hunting culture breaks into the open, as happened when a woman in Montana shot and skinned a Siberian husky, claiming to have mistaken him for a wolf pup. The public was outraged, though millions of other equally intelligent and emotionally complex animals, foxes, rabbits, deer, bears, etc., are routinely killed each year for sport. Sociopaths and psychopaths are astute observers of the external behavior and intentions of others. As one psychopath told an interviewer, "It's like being on the outside looking in." He or she knows the words but not the music, as researchers studying psychopathic military offenders put it. The sadist observes the victim's suffering as through the wrong end of a telescope, at a remote emotional distance. If they knew they were going to die, you'd see much more agitated behavior, Temple Grandin assures Michael Pollan, about animals killed at the slaughterhouse. Grandin sees animals only from the outside, as a set of external signs. Though her efforts to reduce the suffering of animals in slaughter are widely seen as evidence of her compassion for animals, her behavior demonstrates the opposite, indifference to the vulnerability of her victims. Grandin can stand and watch thousands of animals being shot, stabbed, or gassed to death, without emotion. Witnessing an animal at his or her moment of greatest vulnerability, Grandin evidently feels no fellow feeling, only detached curiosity and a professional interest in the process. Some people with autism may find it challenging to empathize with or recognize the distress of others. It is therefore possible that Grandin's emotional detachment while seeing animals being killed has a neurological basis. However, others with autism are able to form close empathetic bonds with other animals, and some, like my friend Emily Morin Barwick, who runs the Bite-Size Vegan website, are outspoken advocates for animal rights. In any event, Grandin's callousness towards animals is indistinguishable from the callousness of non-autistic people in the animal industry. It is also important to distinguish Grandin's inability to empathize with animals, whatever its origins, from the frank sadism and toxic masculinity exhibited by Michael Pollan in his account of his pig hunt. Researcher Karen A. Jacobs observes that many psychopaths act in a way that dramatically exceeds common, socially set thresholds of aggressiveness, manipulation, cruelty, cold-bloodedness, and so forth, exhibiting little patience for the restricted moral realm. The case of Richard Kuklinski, a serial killer and hitman for the top mafia families in New York and New Jersey, is indicative. Kuklinski, who murdered as many as 200 people, took pleasure in looking his victims in the eye as their lives melted away. "I'd be looking in her eyes. I would see the blankness come over it. I'd watch 'em die. I wouldn't just shoot them and walk away. I saw the surprise, the shock, then the blankness." After stalking one stranger, a man whom he felt had slighted him, Kuklinski strangled him outside a bar using a nearby clothesline, swinging him over his shoulder like a bag of laundry so that he could feel him die. The man's body, he recounted, was twitching and kicking. "I kept him a while after he stopped. I kept him a while just to make sure. I actually felt him die. I felt him go limp." Similar descriptions of taking pleasure while watching others die are common in accounts of killing by hunters, ranchers, and locavore slaughterers. Recounting her killing of the cow she has named Kathleen, described in the previous chapter, Kristen Kimball writes, "She bled and kicked, parody of flight, her eyes blank. I wrapped a chain around one of her hind legs and then she kicked again. I held the leg for a moment, felt the strength seep from the big muscles. It takes time to drain all the life from a living thing, as though life were a substance." Tommy Lynn Sells, who murdered as many as 80 people, including children and infants, recounted similar feelings while killing. "It's the sensation of the blood. It's the sensation tying that scarf around your neck and just watching your eyes. It's the sensation of seeing that skin pull apart." As criminologist Scott Bond observes, psychopathic killers view their innocent victims as inhuman objects to be tormented and exterminated for their own amusement. Many people take similar delight in inflicting suffering on non-human animals. After cutting an animal's throat, they enjoy watching them thrash about in their blood while their eyes go blank. Such individuals would likely score highly on Hare's psychopathy checklist, a kind of Voight-Kampff test used to identify people with antisocial personality disorders. Some of the Femivore memoirists exhibit such psychopathic traits as extreme cruelty, impulsiveness, and lack of self-control. Whether they are psychopaths in the clinical sense, however, is less salient than the fact that society grants vicious individuals the right to wield such total power over vulnerable beings, without any accountability or sanction for their sadistic behavior. Millions of ordinary people seek out opportunities either to inflict violence on animals or merely to watch others inflict it. In Spain, bulls are ritually tortured and stabbed to death in stadiums, or are set on fire and chased and beaten through the streets until they die, moaning in agony. Organizers of the live pigeon shoot in Hedgens, Pennsylvania, abduct the birds from the streets of New York and other cities, shove them into crates, and transport them to a fairground in Hedgens to be killed. The pigeons are then released before a cheering crowd and shot to death. After each round, small children are sent into the field to tear the heads off birds who were wounded but not killed outright, amidst raucous cheers from the crowd. Other towns across the U.S. invite similar public slaughters of squirrels, turkeys, and other species. In 2023, when officials in New York City announced a new campaign to exterminate millions of rats, the mainstream news media ran dozens of columns and editorials joking about the impending slaughter, with journalists gleefully offering creative ways to kill them. Even though rats are as emotionally sensitive and intelligent as our own companion animals, pathological indifference to suffering is on the menu, too, of Shark's Fin and Sichuan Pepper, a foodie memoir by Fuchsia Dunlop that finds its author traipsing up and down China on a quest to eat as many exotic animals as possible. The book, one reviewer observed, reads like a bill of lading for dismembered occupants of Noah's Ark: rabbits' heads and turtles' feet, duck tongues and ox throat cartilage, goose intestines and pig's brains. Even the most extreme forms of cruelty leave the author unmoved. There isn't a sense there that you're killing an animal, Dunlop writes. It's simply that you are preparing an ingredient for the table. No one thinks anything of skinning frogs and rabbits while they're still alive. On a panel at the Sydney Writers' Festival in 2011, meanwhile, celebrity chef Anthony Bourdain joined British journalist A. Gill in mocking animal rights and defending the exploitation of geese for foie gras. "I think it's a bullshit issue," Bourdain said. Gill agreed, saying, "I don't really care if animals suffer. If I'm perfectly honest, I don't give a shit." The audience laughed at both quips. In recent decades, the media have shown special interest in men and women who seek out opportunities to kill and butcher animals with their own hands. Killing animals oneself, rather than buying meat neatly packaged at the supermarket, is seen as a sign of moral virtue, a demonstration of one's commitment to a more authentic and honest relation to animals and the food system. However, the opposite is true. The desire not to harm others and not to see others harmed is an attribute of a healthy psyche. There is therefore no more virtue in killing an animal with one's own hands, instead of buying meat at the store, than there is in filming oneself abusing children in one's own basement, instead of merely consuming child porn produced by others. Levi Cole, a critical care nurse in Oregon, says he took up animal slaughter because it gives you a whole different reverence for what you're doing. "Who wants to be a hypocrite?" Cole asks. "So I could become a vegetarian, or I could kill my own animal. But there are worse things than hypocrisy, and deliberately inflicting harm on others is one of them. We are all susceptible, to some degree and at various times, to aggression and even to the rare sadistic impulse. Virtue, however, lies in resisting our antisocial tendencies and in cultivating our better characters. That our society encourages the disinhibition of our worst impulses, by celebrating violence towards animals in no way authorizes us to participate in such evil ourselves, nor does it excuse our indifference to harms committed by others. It is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator, Judith Herman observes in Trauma and Recovery. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. By contrast, the victim asks us to share the burden of the pain, demanding our action, engagement, and remembering. Empathy in other animals. Many of Charles Darwin's fellow naturalists believed that other animals exhibited only two emotions, rage or fear. However, Darwin showed that, like us, other species experience joy, jealousy, terror, astonishment, impatience, and other emotions. Darwin cited one observer who witnessed an elephant captured and bound in Ceylon, who, after being overpowered and made fast, exhibited a grief, most affecting, lying on the ground and uttering choking cries. Animals also exhibit compassion and empathy for one another. The mother calls incessantly for her lost young ones, for instance, a cow for her calf, and the young of many animals call for their mothers. Empathy has since been observed in many other species. Young female chimps have been observed carrying water in their mouths and taking it to an older female who had difficulty walking, then emptying it into her mouth. Capuchins will go out of their way to provide monkeys in adjacent enclosures with food if they see that they don't have any. In India, rhesus monkeys were observed tending to a baby monkey after he was hit by a car. The monkeys encircled the injured infant, whose hind legs were crushed and who lay in the road unable to move. Some of them massaged its legs. Finally, they left the scene carrying the injured baby with them. It was very emotional, a shopkeeper at the scene reported. At a train station in the Indian city of Kanpur, a macaque was observed reviving another monkey after he had been shocked into unconsciousness by an electrified rail. The macaque spent an hour biting, pushing, and even dunking his friend repeatedly in a puddle of water in an effort to revive him. Eventually, he succeeded. You can find this video on my website. But it isn't just primates who exhibit empathy. Scientists in the Netherlands have shown that pigs are highly sensitive to the feelings and emotional states of others, feeling happy when other pigs experience something pleasant, but becoming distraught when seeing other pigs suffer. A dolphin stunned into unconsciousness by a dynamite charge was observed being rescued by two fellow dolphins, who held him above water with their bodies, holding their own breaths in order to do it. Younger elephants have been seen bringing food to an older bull who was too sick to forage for himself. In one case, an elephant whose trunk had been brutally amputated by a poacher was seen being fed by another elephant, though a stranger to herself. Should a baby elephant fall into a pond or river, adult elephants become frantic and work together to save the youngster from drowning. Rats, too, are empathic. In one cruel experiment, researchers put a rat in a water tank without means of escape, then released another rat in an adjacent, dry compartment to watch. Seeing the other rat about to drown, the dry rat worked frantically to free her fellow. Subsequent experiments have shown that rats will sacrifice their own interests, even a favorite reward like chocolate, in order to save a drowning stranger. Ironically, even as such experiments establish empathy in rats, they also establish lack of empathy in human scientists, socialized to accept animal experimentation. The latter continue to repeat this experiment, inflicting trauma on their sensitive captives again and again. Birds and reptiles, too, are highly sensitive to the well-being and suffering of others. Scientists have observed crows conducting funerary rites for their dead. I myself once saw a distraught sparrow frantically trying to revive a friend lying in the road after being struck by a car. The naturalist Conrad Lawrence, who observed greylag geese closely for most of his life, concluded that geese who experience the loss of a life partner feel terrible grief. They fall into deep despondency and even seem to lose interest in life. Even reptiles appear to have empathy. Turtles and tortoises have been observed coming to the rescue of their fellow creatures when found flailing on their backs. In a real-life version of the Voigt-Kampf test, the animals can be seen working singly or with others to set their desperate comrades right again. We are raised to think of the natural world only in terms of competition, violence, and suffering. But while predation and competition are indeed fixtures of nature, so too are symbiosis, mutuality, empathy, and altruism between members of different species. At the Basel Zoo, chimpanzees were seen rescuing an injured bird who had fallen into their enclosure. After handing the bird around, they gently set the creature outside their cage. In another case, an orangutan attempted to rescue a drowning baby bird, initially by trying to coax it onto a leaf, and then, when that failed, by removing the bird and placing her on the ground. In 1996, after a 3-year-old boy fell into the gorilla enclosure at the Brookfield Zoo in Illinois, a western lowland gorilla named Binti Jua cradled him in her arms, then laid him gingerly at the feet of waiting paramedics. A similar incident occurred 10 years earlier at a zoo in the UK. After a 5-year-old boy fell into the gorilla enclosure, a male gorilla named Jambo went to the unconscious boy and gently stroked his back, interposing himself between the child and the other gorillas in a protective gesture until the boy was rescued. Since ancient times, mariners have reported dolphins coming to the aid of drowning people, and dolphins have been seen rescuing drowning dogs as well. Elephants have been observed coming to the rescue of rhinos drowning or becoming stuck in the mud. There are many documented cases of dogs seeking help for injured or incapacitated human companions, dragging them to safety from fires, saving them from drowning, or going to seek help from other humans. Dogs have also been seen rescuing deer, birds, and other dogs from danger. On YouTube, an extraordinary repository of ethological films, hundreds of videos can be found of non-human animals engaged in similar acts of altruism. A bear gently rescuing a drowning bird from a pool of water, an elk pulling a drowning marmot out of his water tank, a horse feeding another horse through the bars of a stall, a pig who, seeing his goat friend flailing in a stream, leaps into the water to push him out, a dog frantically attempting to revive several suffocating fishes lying on a concrete floor by pushing water into their mouths. The ethologist Franz de Waal suggested that empathy is one of two great pillars of moral behavior in animals, the other being reciprocity or a sense of fairness. Far from being a uniquely human trait, then, empathy is an adaptive way of knowing that is widely distributed throughout the animal realm. If, as Edith Stein maintained, empathy is the precondition for human social existence, it may also be a precondition for the interspecies relations necessary for a thriving biotic community. Though some scientists have attributed empathy to a neurophysiological mechanism, mirror neurons that fire in our brains when we witness an emotional state in another, empathy is much more complex than this, requiring a consciousness capable of judgment. Animals don't merely act from instinct, but respond in often creative and intelligent ways to the urgent situations presented by others in distress. The very existence of such a capacity is evidence of highly sophisticated cognition in other species, suggesting an ability to grasp meaning, context, and the perspectives and needs of others. Treating hairy Lyme disease, we share a natural capacity for empathy, then, with many other animals. However, in our species that capacity can become blunted by culture. Prejudice, habit, and structures of power and inequality can distort our ability to perceive the vulnerability of others, or to respond in a morally appropriate way to their suffering. As we saw, Thomas Jefferson, observing the behavior of enslaved mothers after their children were taken away and sold, wrongly concluded that they experienced only transient grief. Jefferson's immersion in slave culture and his own white supremacist beliefs dulled his moral insight and senses, preventing him from empathizing with his supposed racial inferiors. We likewise find it hard to empathize with the beings we exploit, having been raised to view them as degraded inferiors and tools. In The Omnivore's Dilemma, Pollen makes an elaborate show of getting to know the perambulating black dot he has purchased, visiting the cow in person at a distance in a supposed effort to become acquainted with my boy, as he calls him, before returning home. The cow is then transported to a feedlot in Kansas, where, Pollen jokes, he will pay for his room and board, all the corn he could eat, and meds. Pollen pays the animal one more brief visit at a feedlot to see how well he has fattened. For the occasion, he has worn the same carrot-colored sweater he'd worn months earlier at a ranch in South Dakota, ostensibly to help the steer recognize him. Instead, however, author and animal stare dumbly at one another, without any feeling of connection. Glint of recognition, Pollen writes. None whatsoever, he adds. I told myself not to take it personally. 534 and his pen mates have been bred for their marbling after all, not their ability to form attachments. It is an urban myth, however, that animals bred for food are not as emotionally complex or intelligent as other animals, nor are they in any way less capable of forming bonds of friendship. I know many observant people who have lived alongside rescued cows, pigs, chickens, sheep, and other exploited animals, and they reliably report them to be just as expressive, curious, and affectionate as any cat or dog. My friend Harold Brown grew up in Michigan in a family that had raised animals for generations. As a boy, he worked on his grandfather's ranch, where he milked cows, helped deliver calves, and dehorned, castrated, and butchered animals. Later, Harold worked on a dairy farm. Although he had always had affection for the animals he raised, it wasn't until he suffered a heart attack, ironically, due in part to his consumption of beef and dairy, that he began to question the system he had been a part of and his role in it. Eventually, Harold decided to leave the dairy business. A man who had spent his life exploiting and sometimes killing cows now became a vegan and even adopted a rescued steer named Snickers at an animal sanctuary. One day, Harold stopped by the sanctuary to see if Snickers, whom he'd visited only briefly a few times before, would still remember him months later. Arriving at the sanctuary, he found all the cows but Snickers being lavished with attention by visitors. On a whim, Harold opened his arms wide and called out, "Hi, Snickers." To his amazement, Snickers came running across the barnyard to him, then pushed his massive head against Harold's chest. Harold, who'd been raised in a conservative rural community where boys were taught to repress their feelings, broke down. I had this immediate mental image of a light switch right over my heart, he later recalled. He had turned off this compassion switch his whole life when he needed to disconnect himself, mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually, from the animals he butchered and ate. Now, Harold leaves the switch on and is a full-time advocate for abolishing animal agriculture. The reason Michael Pollan, by contrast, doesn't feel a personal connection to steer 534 at the feedlot is not because of a cognitive deficit in the cow, but because of an empathy deficit in Pollan. It does not occur to him that a being who has been brutalized and treated with violent indifference throughout his young life, from the time he was torn from his mother's side at birth, to his experiences of being castrated and branded with an iron without painkillers, then being prodded and shoved onto a crowded truck and driven hundreds of miles to a feedlot, might understandably be wary of the man in the sweater standing beside the feedlot's staff veterinarian. Pollan feels no glimmer of recognition between himself and his boy because he himself has closed the door to such a possibility. He sees only what he is prepared to see, an animate dot in a black sea of bovinity. As Harold's experience shows, though, just as we have learned dissociative behavior towards animals, we can also unlearn it. As children, we have to be taught not to pull our siblings' hair or shove other children off the monkey bars. We then internalize this parental authority as moral authority, associating our feelings of empathy and compassion, and concomitantly, feelings of moral censure, shame, and guilt, with abstract notions of right and wrong. Culture and upbringing therefore play a key role in our ability to engage in empathic connection. Unlike true psychopaths, whose lack of empathy and inability to feel remorse are now thought by some researchers to be genetically based and hardwired into their neurology. Most of us can be cured of our moral indifference towards others if we are only willing to rethink our prejudices and assumptions. A fly drowning in a glass of water. The animal is certainly another existence, and this existence is perceived by everybody, observed the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. If an animal weren't such an existence, then the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza would not have spent so much time considering a drowning fly, as Spinoza did. Even a drowning fly has an existential significance, corresponding to a situation in which a distressed consciousness finds itself. And we can perceive this existential significance if we open ourselves to it. Mahayana Buddhists have argued for centuries that we can be taught K-A-R-U letter 1E47A macron, or compassion, for all suffering beings. Even insects, they hold, are deserving of our respect and solicitude. When we see a fly on our leg, our first response may be to kill it. But as Pema Chodron explains, summarizing the views of Tibetan monk Trungpa Rinpoche, by giving in to our violent impulse, we only sow more seeds of aggression and insensitivity, hindering any awakening of our heart. Instead, we might try having a friendly response to the fly. You could just look at it in a kind way and either let it be there or gently put your hand near it so it will fly away. This transforms the fly's visit from an annoying event into an opportunity for sowing seeds of kindness and tolerance and appreciating the sacredness of life. It turns into a small way of becoming more open-hearted and open-minded, in other words, of freeing yourself. Today, I no longer kill insects and spiders. Sometimes ant scouts find their way onto my kitchen counter. Instead of killing them, I mist them lightly with a water bottle to encourage them to explore elsewhere. The ants eventually get the message and disappear from my kitchen. Occasionally, some other tiny consciousness will stray into my domicile, a moth or fly, a spider or wasp. I have no desire to harm them either. Instead, I gently take them outside, using a butterfly net I keep in my hall closet for that purpose. I do these things not to assuage my guilt over my past injustices to the invertebrate world, nor out of a Kantian sense of objective moral duty, but simply out of concern for my visitors' well-being. It pleases me to set them outside, and they are pleased to be free again. Blood and soil. New snow has all but covered the blood. A farm exhales. Jenna Wagenrich, one-woman farm. All people are Nazis. For the animals, it is an eternal Treblinka. Isaac Bashevis, singer during the 2010 Winter Olympics in British Columbia, a company called Whistler Outdoor Adventures offered tourists the chance to run their own Iditarod by renting sled dogs to drive across the ice. When the games concluded, however, and demand for the dogs slackened, Whistler's parent company ordered the staff to reduce its stock of dogs. The task fell to an employee who'd previously been responsible for the animals' care. A reporter for the New York Times described what happened next. The killing went on for 2 days, and several of the deaths were grisly. When an initial shot failed to kill a dog that was the mother of the employee's family pet, she ran around with her cheek blown off and her eye hanging out, until she was felled by a rifle with a scope, according to the report. The bullet also penetrated another dog, which was not supposed to be part of the kill, and which suffered for about 15 minutes before dying. Another dog, left for dead for 20 minutes, emerged crawling from a mass grave only to be shot again, the report said. The employee said he eventually wrapped his arms in foam padding after the frightened dogs began attacking him. Some of the dogs were killed execution style. In other cases, the worker wrestled the dogs to the ground and stood on them with one foot to shoot them. 100 dogs were shot or stabbed to death. After news of the massacre leaked to the Canadian press, causing an uproar, Whistler released a statement assuring the public that it had only instructed its employee to euthanize the dogs in a proper, legal, and humane manner. For some, however, reports of the massacre, with their descriptions of dying victims crawling out of mass graves after being shot, conjured up images not of euthanasia, from the Latin for a good death, but of atrocities and war crimes. Despite the public's revulsion at the killings, however, the Canadian Parliament passed no new legislation to prevent similar massacres from occurring in future, whether of dogs or of other animals. Under Canadian criminal law, the reporter noted, it is not illegal to kill dogs using a gun, provided it is done without undue suffering. In a sense, the entirety of our treatment of other beings revolves around this one belief, that we are permitted to kill animals for our purposes so long as we don't cause them to suffer unduly. There is a scene in the science fiction film Independence Day depicting an alien invasion of the Earth, in which the U.S. president finds himself in the grip of a telepathic exchange with one of the invaders. "What do you want us to do?" he asks his enemy, to which the alien replies, "Die." We ourselves ask as little of the other beings with whom we share our world. We don't want the animals we exploit to suffer unnecessarily, only as much as is necessary for them to die. And animals deserve to die, we think, because they do not deserve to live. This was the view, we saw, of Farmer J. Bost in his winning essay for the Defending Your Dinner contest in the New York Times. "Am I willing," Bost asked, "to divide the world into that which I have deemed is worthy of being spared the inevitable and that which is not worthy?" And Bost said that he was. All conscious beings can be separated into one of two categories, those deserving of continued life and those undeserving of it. And only human beings make it into the first group. This idea that some beings are simply unworthy of life, and that as a consequence of their worthlessness it is permissible to kill them en masse, so long, however, as it is done humanely, is not without historical precedent. A century ago, the same idea appeared in Europe, only the beings deemed unworthy and killable happened to be human. In 1920, Karl Binding, a professor of law at Freiburg University, and Alfred Hoche, a physician, published authorization for the destruction of life unworthy of life, arguing that the vitality of the German nation was being sapped by the growing ranks of individuals they termed Lebensunwärts Leben, or life unworthy of life. Those unworthy of life fell into one of two categories: the physically disabled and chronically ill, whose lives were compromised by suffering, and the mentally ill and mentally enfeebled, imbeciles, whose degenerate natures made them useless to society. The authors argued that the humane thing to do was to allow the German state to kill them. Written at the height of the eugenics movement, Binding and Hoche's manifesto presented state euthanasia as a mercy not only to society, but to the unworthy individuals themselves. It was well known that physicians sometimes overdosed terminal patients with morphine to relieve their suffering at the end, and few doubted that allowing such patients to die painlessly was humane and just. Why, then, shouldn't physicians also be permitted to euthanize the chronically ill, the disabled, and the cognitively impaired? Such defective individuals would be relieved of the suffering caused by the worthlessness of their lives, while society would in turn be relieved of a drain on its finite resources by idiots. Though Binding and Hoche couched their arguments in humanitarian terms, their concern for suffering could not disguise their violent contempt for the persons they deemed expendable. As Saul Friedlander observes, the authors used the argument that the terminally ill deserved the right to a relatively painless death to justify the murder of those considered inferior. Apart from Mein Kampf, no other book proved as influential in shaping later Nazi attitudes towards mass killing as Binding and Hoche's slender work. 2 decades later, Adolf Hitler operationalized Binding and Hoche's proposal, ordering his personal physician and the chief of the Reich Chancellery to arrange the killing of so-called Ballast-Existenzen, subpersons whose existence was unnecessary ballast, weighing on society. Though the killings were conducted in secret, the Nazis had prepared the German public for the slaughter with eugenicist charts showing alarming, year-to-year growth in the mentally disabled population, warning that imbeciles would soon outnumber healthy Germans, destroying the nation. Thousands of mentally and physically disabled adults and children, war veterans, epileptic and autistic children, and chronically ill patients were subsequently murdered by the German state. The three ideas that served as the basis of this grotesque state crime: that some beings are unworthy of life, that mass killing of such beings can be conducted humanely, and that enacting such violence is simply part of the cycle of life, have been put into circulation again today, this time by enlightened omnivores in defense of the animal food economy. Disturbingly, we find more than a passing resemblance between the system of animal agriculture and the totalitarian state. Life unworthy of life. Initially, the victims of Hitler's euthanasia program were killed through starvation or poison injection. Soon, however, the Chancellery hit upon the idea of gassing victims using carbon monoxide. Secret gas chambers were hastily constructed in several cities in Germany and Austria beginning in 1940. By the end of the war, Hitler's Action T4 program, named for Tiergartenstrasse 4, the street address of the Chancellery, had euthanized as many as 200,000 people. Significantly, the program served as a trial project for the much larger extermination of European Jewry, Roma, and other enemies of the Third Reich. Throughout this period of state criminality, Binding and Hodge's perverse language of humane and painless mass killing found its way into the Nazis' own self-justifications for their genocidal policies. Even as the Nazis sought out opportunities to humiliate, torment, and kill their Jewish and Roma victims, working them to death as slaves in labor camps and factories, conducting scientific experiments on them, forcing mothers to watch the murder of their children, they reverted time and again to the rhetoric of care in eliminating their victims. Genocide was internally legitimated in Nazi documents as a good death for those who did not deserve to live. Killings were supposed to occur as instantaneously and impersonally as possible, ostensibly without suffering. The SS embraced gassing as the most efficient and compassionate way to liquidate enemies en masse, with the Action T4 program serving as the inspiration for more industrial-scale facilities at Auschwitz and other death camps. The Nazis settled upon Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide already in wide use for exterminating insects and small mammals, as the preferred means. It took but a minor technical adjustment to switch the targeted population from non-human parasites to supposed human ones. The Sonderwagen, or gas trucks, were a second means of killing in quantity, employed by the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units of the SS, initially against members of the Polish intelligentsia. As the Wehrmacht drove further east, Reinhard Heydrich, Hitler's deputy, who directed the Einsatzgruppen, repurposed them to murder the thousands of Jews now under Nazi control. After members of the Einsatzgruppen complained about the stress of shooting Jewish women and children at close range, the SS began experimenting with mobile gas chambers. Victims would be herded into vans, then driven to mass graves. The truck exhaust was diverted into the back, and the victims would be killed during the short journey to their destination. Rudolf Hirsch, commandant of Auschwitz, described the Zyklon B method as more humane than other methods. August Becker, the SS officer and chemist who helped design the Sonderwagen, saw his method in the same light, complaining that van drivers sometimes failed to press down enough on the accelerator, leading victims to lose consciousness but not to die. It has proved that if my instructions are followed and the levers are properly adjusted, death comes faster and the prisoners fall asleep peacefully, he wrote his superiors. Distorted faces and excretions, such as were observed before, no longer occur. In reality, the women, men, and children who were gassed died horrific deaths. The victims of the Sonderwagen realized that they were being slowly smothered, and parents died trying to shield dying children from the carbon monoxide. Becker, however, unable to empathize with his victims, could perceive their death agonies only from a vast, uncomprehending distance, as external behaviors. The suffering of Jews and others at Treblinka and other camps, transported by train in the same cars used to ferry cattle to their doom, was even more horrific. The victims, deceived into thinking they were to be given showers, were made to strip naked, then beaten and marched at gunpoint into a large room. Then the doors were slammed shut and the lights suddenly went out. As the terrified people screamed and struggled to open the door, realizing the trap, an operator on the roof dropped canisters of Zyklon B into a chute. The poison landed in a grate covered hearth, spreading the gas quickly throughout the chamber. Minutes later, when the doors were opened again, the victims were found in a pile near the door, the weaker ones on the bottom, crushed by the stronger ones in their desperate struggle to escape. A Jewish Sonderkommando work crew then removed the bodies and cleaned the chamber so that the next batch of victims could be brought in. Return of the gas chamber. In a kind of return of the repressed animal origins of the Holocaust, the meat industry has lately embraced gas chambers as the final solution to the problem of animal welfare, as the humane way to liquidate animals in the millions. Even the Sonderwagen have made a comeback. Organic farmers can now pay to have a mobile gas chamber called a Mobile Poultry Processing Unit, MPPU, driven directly to their farm, to save them the trouble of having to transport their victims to a slaughterhouse or to kill them themselves. State wildlife officials, too, have borrowed from the SS toolkit. Because Canada geese and ducks are now flourishing in urban areas due to climate change, wildlife officials in New York, Colorado, and other states have been herding them, too, into mobile gas chambers. The birds are corralled into the vans, the doors are quickly shut, and the truck exhaust is pumped into the sealed compartment, where the birds slowly suffocate to death on their way to the incinerator. Temple Grandin is the leading proponent of using gas chambers to exterminate animals. Gas chambers are better than having slaughter plant workers capture and shackle thousands of distressed, flapping birds each day, a practice that causes a high percentage of broken wings. Grandin told the Canadian Cattlemen Association, in a reporter's paraphrase. Birds don't like to be hung upside down, Grandin said. If you go to a chamber system, you get rid of the stressful situation. People are not going to torture dead chickens. An added benefit, the reporter noted, is that gas chambers also make workers' lives easier. Grandin's enthusiasm for gas chambers also extends to mammals. Gas chambers have also been adopted by hog operations to make the task of disposing of surplus or runt piglets easier for barn workers, especially the new recruits. There is nothing humane, however, about being gassed, whether the victims are human or non-human. An undercover investigation at Black Eagle Farm, an organic, sustainable animal operation in Virginia, documented the excruciating suffering of chickens during the farm's depopulation process. After turning off the lights to the henhouse to disorient the birds, workers grabbed the hens by their legs and violently pulled them from their perches, then took them outside and shoved them into coffin-like metal boxes 5 feet long and 3 feet wide, 500 individuals at once. After slamming the door to the chamber shut, they then pumped freezing cold sea otwo into the tank through a hose. The terrified birds inside struggled to escape, injuring themselves and others in the process. Investigators found that while birds on top burn and suffocate to death, those lower in the chamber were often found alive and suffering an hour later. Workers would then seize the injured birds and smash their heads in with boards. Grandin, we have seen, earns her livelihood by making adjustments to corrals and kill chutes, so that doomed animals are given the illusion of safety. The SS, too, went to elaborate lengths to deceive their victims about what was about to happen to them, installing fake shower heads in the gas chambers and disguising the walled corridors leading to shooting pits with branches from pine trees. When victims arrived at Treblinka, they were given haircuts and delousing to make them think they weren't in imminent danger. Then they were killed. The Nazis did these things not out of kindness, but to prevent their victims from rebelling, hence impeding the efficient functioning of the apparatus. Similar attention to the psychology of the victims is evident in animal husbandry and in blood sports, as when hunters deploy duck decoys or artificial calls to fool animals into thinking they are safely among comrades. Some slaughterhouses still employ a Judas goat or sheep, an animal raised on the premises and hence accustomed to the smell of blood and brains and death, to lead their victims calmly to their deaths. The owner of Dalla Terra Ranch, a grass-fed organic lamb operation in Iowa, has credited Grandin for getting the lambs to go their deaths quietly and without agitation or fear. With no fighting to turn back, no bawling, no injured animals. The owner thanked Grandin for her wonderful advice and insight into how to improve what was previously an unpleasant event for the livestock. Sardonic irony and euphemism to describe violence against animals is a staple of many farming narratives, as when Barbara Kingsolver describes killing animals as a lot less fun than spending an autumn day picking apples off trees, or when Chef Jim Weaver describes force-feeding birds for foie gras as probably not as fun as paddling in a pond. With a wink and smile, organic farmers meanwhile quip that the animals they raise have a nice life and only one bad day. Ironic understatement was a staple, too, of internal Nazi communications. "This is not a pretty business," Harold Turner, chief of staff of the military government under the Third Reich, remarked of the mass shooting of thousands of Jews in Serbia. In a letter dated July 16, 1941, Heinz Herpner, the higher SS and police leader of Warthegau, similarly warned Adolf Eichmann that, as winter came, Jews captured and imprisoned by advancing German forces would not have adequate food. "One might weigh honestly," Herpner wrote, "if the most humane solution might not be to finish off those of the Jews who are not employable by means of some quick-working device. At any rate, that would be more pleasant than to let them starve to death. It would be a grave insult to the victims who died at the hands of the Nazis to credit such monsters as Herpner, Himmler, or Hirsch with having genuinely cared about the suffering of their victims. However, we do not need to accept the Nazis' own lies about their behavior to recognize the value that a rhetoric of humane murder might have for the perpetrators themselves. Even as the Nazis justified their deception of their victims on grounds that doing so helped make for a less stressful and therefore more humane dying experience. As one scholar puts it, their concern was utterly cynical, a way to distance themselves from their crimes. In his book Ordinary Men, his account of the men of Polish Reserve Police Battalion 101, who massacred thousands of Jews, scholar Christopher Browning exclaims, "A quick death without agony of anticipation was considered an example of human compassion." In reality, Nazi policy had nothing to do with compassion, and the Nazis' humane methods caused unspeakable suffering in their victims, whether the latter were gassed in darkness in a chamber or shot in a field in the sunny countryside. Some researchers have suggested that Hitler instructed Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, to implement the genocide as humanely as possible. But as Robert Payne notes, Hitler, on the contrary, told Himmler that it was not enough for the Jews simply to die. They must die in agony. Himmler then turned the problem over to his advisors, who concluded that a slow, agonizing death could be brought about by placing Jewish prisoners in freight cars in which the floors were coated with quicklime, which produced excruciating burns. The advisors estimated that it would take 4 days for the prisoners to die, and for that whole time, the freight cars could be left standing on some forgotten siding. Overt sadism aside, however, the suffering of the Nazis' victims was merely the byproduct of the policy of extermination. Once the decision to kill had been made, everything else was to be permitted. Nazi quips about pleasant deaths and humane murder only served to demonstrate the vast differential in power between perpetrators and victims, those authorized to kill and those authorized to die. Today's apologists for the meat economy similarly make use of understatement and irony to emphasize their total supremacy over their animal victims. Notwithstanding their claims to care about the animals they kill, even the most conscientious of meat apologists can't help mocking the vulnerability of their victims. It is more than coincidence that the slaughterhouse ramp designed by Temple Grandin is known in the meat industry as the Stairway to Paradise, while the funnel at Treblinka, through which prisoners were herded to their deaths, was called Himmelweg, or Road to Heaven, by the SS. Sadistic mockery of victims has long been a feature of modern animal agriculture. More than a century ago, the ramp leading to the killing floor at the Chicago yards was called the Bridge of Sighs, after the Pont dei Sospiri, or Bridge of Sighs, in Venice. The latter, constructed in the early 17th century, conveyed the condemned to a prison from which there would be no return, a one-way trip to sorrow. Should the baby live? Surprisingly, Binding and Hotch's discourse of humane killing has been revived today not only by apologists for the new animal economy, but also by Peter Singer, the utilitarian philosopher credited with having inspired the modern animal rights movement. Utilitarianism, again, is the moral theory that tells us we should act in such a way as to maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, or, in Singer's version, of all sentient beings, while minimizing their pain and suffering. The trouble with the theory, critics have long contended, is that because utilitarians tend to value individuals only as vessels or carriers of happiness, they fail to recognize the dignity of the individual. This can make it hard for them to explain why killing someone is wrong, particularly in cases when the life of that someone tends to yield more unhappiness than happiness overall. There is thus a tendency in utilitarianism to view the lives of persons as fungible or interchangeable, which in turn can potentially render those unable to defend themselves vulnerable to grave harms. This has led Singer to maintain that causing animals to suffer is worse than killing them, and also that killing disabled human infants ought to be legally permissible. In 1985, Singer published a book with bioethicist Helga Kuss called Should the Baby Live? The Problem with Handicapped Infants, suggesting that it should be legally permissible to kill babies born with severe disabilities. Recycling a line of argument first developed by Binding and Hotch, the authors noted that physicians already exercise discretion in allowing terminally ill patients and severely disabled newborns to die. Why then not permit more active interventions? The authors rejected the idea that human life has any irreducible value in itself, and they denied that all lives could be considered of equal value. The fact is, they wrote, that some lives are not worth living. It would therefore be the very best for all concerned in cases of severe disability that children be killed, provided that it be done swiftly and painlessly. The authors gave the example of a baby born with Down syndrome. If the mother doesn't want the child, they maintained, it should be legally permissible to kill it. Let us grant the author's contention that, in cases of extreme suffering, an individual may well prefer death to life. In such cases, killing may reasonably be held permissible, as when an individual in extreme pain is dying and wishes to be relieved of their suffering. However, Singer has been too quick to devalue the lives and experiences of disabled people, defectives, as he has sometimes called them, and his views on when and under what conditions intellectually disabled individuals may be legitimately put to death have rightly been described by critics as troublingly imprecise. More disturbingly, like Binding and Hotch, Singer and Kuss defended infanticide in Should the Baby Live? Not merely as a way to prevent future suffering, but also on grounds that it would minimize the costs to society of caring for the disabled, pointing to the alarming increase in the number of children enrolled in some form of special education, a 15% increase between 1977 and 1982, from 3.5 million to 4 million. Singer and Kuss warned that society might be fast approaching a limit to the burden of dependence, observing that if we attempt to keep all handicapped infants alive. Irrespective of their future prospects, we will have to give up other things which we may well regard as at least equally important. As more and more disabled people end up in state care, already stretched resources will have to be stretched even further. It would therefore be reasonable for a community to decide that its resources are more urgently spent on other tasks than caring for handicapped newborn infants, rejected by their parents. The authors proposed lethal injection to deal with the problem. In defending this position, Singer and Coase criticized as incoherent the view that while all humans have inherent value, all non-human animals have none. Since some animals in fact exhibit equal or greater cognitive functions than so-called marginal cases of mentally disabled humans, they pointed out, arguments for the sanctity or unique dignity of human life are insupportable, rather than extend the notion of inherent dignity to all sentient beings. However, the authors instead used evidence of complex cognition in other species to deny inviolable rights to all individuals, of whatever species, including humans. At a conference in the Dutch city of Utrecht some years back, Singer spoke on a welfarist panel entitled Animals and the Harm of Death. The broad takeaway from the panel was that killing animals does not harm them, because death can only harm beings with a sense of self through time and therefore with an ability to anticipate and plan for the future. Earlier that morning, at the same conference, a panel of Dutch scientists had proceeded on the basis of this same view, in a discussion of the most humane ways to kill farmed animals. The researchers had displayed graphs plotting the time, from seconds to many minutes, that it took the brain activity of victims to cease after being subjected to various treatments. Was it better to shoot them or to gas them, to suffocate or electrocute them? I happened to be at this conference, and I attended both panels. When Singer's panel ended, I approached him and asked him how, as a preference, utilitarian who'd staked his career on the principle that we ought to maximize the preferences of other animals, he could deny that the one preference that animals have above all others is to live. Singer curtly replied that I hadn't shown that animals in fact have such a preference. I responded that an animal will endure even great pain and abuse if she or he believes it will help them live longer. So great is the desire to live that a fox caught in a hunter's trap may even gnaw off his own limb to free himself. I cannot recall what Singer said in reply, but my feeling at the time, and since, is that there is something wrong with a moral philosophy that purports to care about the happiness of a class of beings, whether farmed animals or disabled children, while remaining indifferent to their violent deaths. The ancient philosopher Epicurus held that death does not harm us, only the fear of death does. Few people, however, have agreed with Epicurus through the ages. The reason we hold murder to be the most serious of crimes, worse than torture, is because death is the only truly irreparable harm an individual can suffer. The individual loses everything by death, all possibility, all hope, all qualities. If death is not a bad thing, the philosopher Adam Beresford asks rhetorically, paraphrasing Aristotle's view, why is it wrong to bring it upon someone else? As Beresford notes, Aristotle is the only Greek philosopher who doesn't need to answer that profoundly silly question, because he is the only one to hold on to the common-sense view that death is a very bad thing indeed. Blood und Boden, the cycle of life and decay. In Orwell's 1984, the totalitarian state of Oceania uses language to render opposite ideas falsely equivalent to one another, in order to prevent the citizenry from thinking outside the terms of the given order. If freedom is slavery, then to resist slavery is pointless, since it amounts to resisting freedom. In the newspeak of today, the enlightened omnivore similarly equates the freedom of animals with their enslavement, equates killing animals with caring for them, and even collapses the existential distinction between life and death, all to prevent us from thinking outside the terms of the animal system. Life and death are the same moment, thus writes Lear Keith in her attack on vegetarianism. It is a profound spiritual truth that you cannot have life without death, echoes Joel Salatin. Life requires death, Derek Jensen says, affirming that all eating requires death. Everything has to die sometime, a woman rancher agrees. Through the commonality of death, intones Jason Mark, the chief editor of Sierra magazine, we reaffirm our kinship with the other animals on Earth. Do such authors mean that, as we and other suffering beings share a similar existential condition, a similar vulnerability to death, we ought to show animals compassion as a way to affirm our creaturely solidarity with them? They do not. Rather, they mean that the best way to reaffirm our kinship with other animals is to kill them. As Jason Mark elaborates in his Sierra editorial on the moral case for meat, I would argue that while every creature deserves the respect of a humane death, no animal has the right to live forever, humans included. We too will end up as worm food, the cycle of life and death turning once more. I can't imagine a better end than having my ashes dumped in the compost pile, so that my bones might feed the soil that helps feed my family. The reader searches in vain, however, to learn how the author wishes to die, or to be killed, so that he can be composted. While locavores sermonize endlessly about the cycle of life and death, they hold their own lives, and those of the ones they love, infinitely dear. It's only the lives of other animals they hold cheap. In their view, the latter ought to be grateful for our condescension in granting them life, however briefly conferred and however violently snatched away again. The omnivore's equivocal contention that life requires death is meanwhile true only in the banal sense that a world in which organisms literally lived forever would eventually run out of resources. That is a far cry from Keith's assertion, though, that for someone to live, someone else does indeed have to die, by which she means to be killed. All forms of agriculture, it is true, take an ecological toll on other beings. Growing crops leads to the deaths of millions of insects, mice, and other small animals, who get caught up in harvesters and other farm equipment. However, we could minimize such collateral damage by utilizing new technologies and methods, if we chose to. Furthermore, since most crops are fed not to humans, but to non-human animals raised for slaughter, switching to a plant-based diet would radically reduce the number of animals killed by mechanized agriculture. For the enlightened omnivore, though, violence and death are not to be feared or minimized, but welcomed as beautiful, life-giving metaphysical truths. Killing insects in her garden one day, Keith has the epiphany that life isn't possible without death, and that the soil wanted death, blood meal, bone meal, dead animals. So Keith begins feeding her soil blood and bones. I've learned to kill, she writes, and I've learned to say my own grace. But Keith's aesthetic unity between blood, soil, and violence has troubling historical antecedents. Similar ideas in the early organic foods movement were championed by British fascists, then later also taken up by the Nazis. For the latter, metaphysical qualities of blood and soil were inseparable from a wider conception of cyclical nature and of the cleansing violence that made its harmony possible. As Fritz Wurz, a Nazi professor of medicine, maintained, blood and soil is critical to the metabolic cycle of humans, animals, and nature. Goebbels himself commissioned at least 7 feature-length films on the subject of blood and soil, among them Uiger Wald, The Eternal Forest, depicting a master race whose roots lie in the sacred soil fertilized for centuries by the richness of their blood. Such films evoke not merely connection to the land, but rituals of violent blood sacrifice. As Kiernan observes, only advanced industrial killing could give Germany back its primeval past. Appeals to the supposed eternal verities of nature to legitimate violence have always been dangerous, but never more so than in the case of Nazism. For fascists in Italy and Germany alike, violence was a way to achieve a higher spiritual state of national being. Nature knows no political boundaries, Hitler wrote. She places life forms on this globe and then sets them free in a play for power. The Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt elaborated on this concept, maintaining that, in Tim Snyder's words, Racial enemies were chosen by nature, and the superior race had the responsibility to struggle and kill and die. Mass killing of more vulnerable beings was seen not as an ethical problem, but as an instantiation of natural facts: life, death, violence, suffering, which must lie forever beyond the reach of moral judgment. Rudolf Höss, before joining the Nazis and rising in their ranks to become SS Commandant of Auschwitz, had been part of the proto-fascist, back-to-the-land agrarian movement known as the Artaman League. In his autobiography, published after his execution for crimes against humanity, Höss describes the killing at the Auschwitz death camp in pastoral terms. In the spring of 1942, hundreds of blossoming people walked beneath the blossoming fruit trees of the farmstead, most of them never guessing they were on their way to the gas chambers and to death. I can still see this image of growth and decay quite clearly, emphasis added. In her book Eichmann Before Jerusalem, scholar Bettina Stangneth remarks of this passage: thinking about the eternal cycle of growth and decay made the extermination of millions of people into a natural occurrence, and the murderers into a force of nature, the right hand of natural law. Höss aestheticized mass killing, passing off a deliberate policy to murder millions of innocent people as a thing of beauty, merely part of the natural cycle of life. Today we find a similar aestheticization of mass killing in omnivorous discourse, as when Michael Pollan praises Salatin's farm for offering a view of the whole cycle of birth, growth, death, and decay. Eager to participate in Salatin's death dealing, both because he is curious, he writes, and because he wants to know if I could bring myself to do it, Pollan personally slits the throats of dozens of chickens, blankly watching their violent spasms as they die. Absorbed in the rhythm of the work, Pollan finds that he's able to kill without a thought to anything but my technique, to the point where he got fairly good at it. In a rare moment of self-awareness, he acknowledges that the most morally troubling thing about killing is that after a while it is no longer morally troubling. Such psychic numbing, as psychologist Robert J. Lifton termed it, is also well documented among perpetrators of war crimes. Pollan wonders idly if the chickens he's killing can smell the blood or recognize the knife in the hands of their killers, but he shrugs off the question, saying, "I have no idea." My late friend Corinne Davis, however, who spent more than 3 decades living with and caring for chickens, believed that chickens are well aware of what is being done to them and others. Lest anyone think that chickens don't mind hearing and seeing other chickens die violently in front of them, nothing could be further from the truth. Pollan, though, is too immersed in killing the animals to have much time for these reflections, because you're working on an assembly, or really disassembly, line, which has a rhythm of its own that soon overpowers your mind as well as your body. Occasionally, the sinister nature of the workings of Polyphe's farm intrudes upon Pollan's pastoral idyll, when a death smell rises up from the rotting flesh of the compost piles. But the pleasure Pollan takes at mealtime smothers any faint stirrings of conscience. Thankfully, all of that, the killing cones too, had retreated to the mental background for me, chased by the smoky sweet aromas of the meal, which I found myself thoroughly able to enjoy. Only when the birds are dead do they truly come alive in Pollan's prose, in aestheticized descriptions of their corpses. Viscera as unexpectedly beautiful, glistening in a whole palette of slightly electric colors, from the steely blue striations of the heart muscle to the sleek milk chocolate liver to the dull mustard of the gallbladder. Hitler was a vegetarian. "We shall never be rough and heartless when it is not necessary," declared Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Gestapo and the overseer of the concentration camps. "We Germans, who are the only people in the world who have a decent attitude towards animals, will also assume a decent attitude towards these human animals." As Nestor Russell sardonically observes, when the sensitive Himmler instructed that human animals be killed, much like with other animals, it was preferable these acts be undertaken without cruelty. All were gently to go to sleep. Apologists for the meat economy sometimes bring up Hitler's vegetarianism, and the Nazis' love of animals, as evidence of a supposed affinity between animal rights and Hitlerism. In reality, the Nazi view of humane mass murder coincided with their view of the humane killing of animals, and the two views reinforced one another. Many Nazi and SS officials had personal backgrounds in animal breeding and husbandry before the war, and once in power they applied this same skill set to implement Hitler's eugenics program. Himmler had himself studied animal agriculture at university and had once been a chicken farmer. As one SS newspaper boasted, Himmler merely enlarged on these practices, subsequently with regard to breeding, selection, and perhaps even what he understood by extermination of vermin. In 1944, the Nazis passed the strongest animal welfare law in Germany's history. Like other Nazi laws, it was framed in anti-Semitic terms, as a way to contrast supposed Nazi sensitivity towards animals with the cruelty of the Jewish people, whose kosher laws specified that animals be conscious when butchered. The Animals Protection Movement, the law read, strongly promoted by the National Socialist government, has long demanded that animals be given anesthesia before being killed. The overwhelming majority of the German people have long condemned killing without anesthesia, a practice universal among Jews, as against the cultivated sensitivities of our society. However, just as the Nazis' decent attitude toward their human victims failed to spare those victims the least suffering, their decent animal welfare laws failed to end the exploitation, killing, or suffering of animals under the Third Reich either. The Nazis were obsessed with health, fitness, and eating natural foods. The latter, particularly whole grains and plant foods, were seen as important for staving off food scarcity and preserving Aryan racial supremacy. However, the Nazis saw themselves as enlightened omnivores, not ethical vegetarians, and they believed that the natural diet for Germans was a mixed diet, containing both meat and plant food. Meat production, in fact, increased under the Third Reich, as Hitler's generals struggled to get animal flesh to the front lines, in the belief that meat was integral to the strength of the German fighting man. In occupied Poland in 1940, Aryans received an allotment of 9 ounces of meat each week, while Jews were allotted less than 2 ounces. The Nazis meanwhile banned vegetarian societies in Germany and in the lands they occupied, and persecuted their leaders. They also conducted horrific scientific experiments on non-human animals, as well as on Jews, Roma, and prisoners of war. Hitler followed a largely vegetarian diet, not out of concern for animals, but as a model of dietary virtue, publicly, and to control his weight, digestive troubles, insomnia, nerves, and muscle tremors, privately. He was not fastidious about his diet, however. A flexitarian until the end, Hitler continued to indulge now and then in his favorite liver dumplings and Bavarian sausages. As for Hitler's vaunted love of dogs, that too has been exaggerated. As Charles Patterson observes, Hitler often carried a dog whip and sometimes used it to beat his dog in the vicious way he had seen his father beat his own dog. Though Hitler was fond of Blondie, his German shepherd, what he seemed most pleased by was Blondie's adoration and obedience. And in his final days, Hitler showed no more respect for Blondie's life than he had for any of the lives of his millions of other victims. Worried that the cyanide he'd been given might not be potent enough, he instructed an SS physician to test it on Blondie first. It worked. Hitler decided to use a different method anyway and shot himself the next day. The following afternoon, Goebbels and his wife Magda asked an SS dentist to administer morphine to their 6 children. After being sedated, the children were administered ampoules of cyanide. Hitler's regime thus ended as it began in the compassionate murder of children, the animal of bad faith. In his book Anti-Semite and Jew, published after the war, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre sought to explain how an ideology as plainly irrational and dangerous as antisemitism should have continued to thrive in France even after the Nazis' murder of European Jewry. Antisemitism was not merely a belief or opinion. Sartre held, but a passion or existential project around which the antisemite organizes his or her identity and sense of life purpose. In choosing to hate Jews, the antisemite adopts a comprehensive attitude, not only toward Jews, but toward society and history as well. For the antisemite, hatred of the other serves to lend meaning and order to an otherwise confusing and threatening world. Without the figure of the Jew, the antisemite would be nothing, for it is only vis-a-vis the Jew and the Jew alone that the antisemite realizes he has rights. There is nothing the antisemite has to do to merit his superiority, as it is bestowed at birth. Merely in treating the Jew as an inferior and pernicious being, he or she affirms membership in an elite. A similar psychological structure subtends our dominion over non-human animals. My worth as a human being derives from the worthlessness of all other beings of the earth. Just as a bank creates money by putting a mark in its ledger to record a new asset, I open the ledger of nature and scrawl down the compound word, not animal, creating at a stroke a value for myself that hadn't existed before. Even if I commit murder, I retain an inherent dignity lacking in every mere beast, simply because I am human. I may know nothing of literature or physics, but I can take pride in the accomplishments of Shakespeare or Einstein, as if I myself had penned Hamlet or invented the general theory of relativity. Yet it would never occur to me to take responsibility for Pol Pot or Hitler, too. If our contempt for other beings was a matter of simple ignorance, then we might be easily cured of it through education. However, the meat-eater doesn't arrive on the scene a tabula rasa open to better arguments, but comes armed with a glittering array of ready-made arguments, whetted against his appetites, to defend against every inconvenient truth. As Sartre observes, antisemitism isn't ignorance but an existential orientation towards the world. With its slender scientific coding, antisemitism always precedes the facts that are supposed to call it forth. This makes the antisemite impervious to reason and to experience. The speciesist, likewise, knows in advance of every fact that all animals are the same, i.e., inferior. If it is shown that animals use language, it will then be claimed that they can't use syntax. If it is shown they can use syntax, it will be claimed they lack domain general intelligence. And so on. We move the goalposts to justify our prejudices, and at some level we know it. The term for this habit of self-deceit is what Sartre called bad faith. Ordinarily, when we accuse someone of acting in bad faith, we mean that he or she has acted duplicitously towards another. Someone who makes a promise without intending to keep it is said to have acted in bad faith. However, in Sartre's usage, bad faith is a lie in which we are both the deceiver and the deceived. We know the truth, but we hide that truth from ourselves. In this way, we seek to avoid responsibility for our choices and values. In Aesop's fable of the fox and grapes, a fox repeatedly leaps at ripe grapes just outside her reach. Finally, she turns away, muttering bitterly that they were probably sour anyway. The fox finds it easier to blame the grapes and to tell herself she never really wanted them than to admit her own limitations. That is bad faith. We engage in bad faith either by avoiding some displeasing truth or, contrarily, by clinging to some pleasing untruth. To put it differently, I can pretend to myself that I am something that I am not, or I can pretend to myself that I am not what I in fact am. Consider a man who cheats on his partner and lies to her about it, telling himself, "After all, I don't want to hurt her. It's best if she doesn't know." He represents himself to himself as being what he is not, a faithful, loving partner, while denying what he in fact is, a person unable to keep his commitments. By presenting his lies to his partner as altruism, the man tries to escape responsibility for his actions. But whatever he chooses to tell himself, he has behaved badly. Our relations with other animals are suffused with this psychological structure. Scientists describe sacrificing animals in their experiments rather than killing them. Wildlife officials speak of managing animal resources. Instead of shooting, gassing, or stomping to death millions of animals, often at the behest of cattle ranchers. Hunters portray the animals they terrorize and kill as equal participants in a sport, claiming to hunt in order to promote conservation, when in truth they hunt because they take pleasure in exerting violent power over other beings. These and other perpetrators of animal harm rely on euphemism less to deceive the public than to hide the truth from themselves. Few people, likewise, know the true nature of the meat industry, but most also would prefer not to know. Hence the bad faith arguments deployed by meat eaters when confronted with veganism. Vegans are told that plants are alive too, though plants aren't conscious and don't suffer. That lions eat gazelles, though unlike lions we aren't obligate carnivores. That we need protein, though animal protein is no higher in quality than protein from plants. There is more protein in 2 slices of whole bread, or 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, or half a cup of cooked lentils, than in 2 slices of bacon. Such arguments are offered not in earnest, but to fend off genuine moral reflection. Vegans are meanwhile mocked in our society not because their positions are ridiculous, but because they pose a threat to the violence of the established order. What he wishes, what he prepares, is the death of the Jew, Sartre observed of the anti-Semite. Though not all the enemies of the Jew demand his death openly, still, the measures they propose, all of which aim at his abasement, at his humiliation, at his banishment, amount to the same thing, which is a desire for the Jew's death. We have likewise organized our material and psychic lives around the death of the animal. The degradation of non-human animals in our culture, in children's books poking fun of farting dogs and stinking pigs, in the humiliated captives we put on display at zoos and aquaria, or brutalize or kill in public spectacles like rodeos, bullfights, and sport fishing shows, are invocations of the pogrom. It is no accident that George Orwell should have chosen a small family farm as the basis of his allegory about totalitarianism in Animal Farm. Both animal agriculture and totalitarianism take as their basis the annihilation of the individual. The state is everything, the individual nothing, as Benito Mussolini put it. Primo Levi, in his survivor's account of Auschwitz, observes that the SS exterminated the Jews twice, first psychologically, by stripping them of their humanity as individuals, then physically, by murdering them. The one was the prelude to the other. When Jewish work details were marched outside the gates of Auschwitz through the bitter winter cold, Polish villagers mistook their wretched condition for moral debasement. They think that as we have been condemned to this life of ours, reduced to our condition, we must be tainted by some mysterious, grave sin. They hear us speak in many different languages, which they do not understand and which sound to them as grotesque as animal noises. They see us reduced to ignoble slavery, without hair, without honor, and without names, beaten every day, more abject every day, and they never see in our eyes a light of rebellion, or of peace, or of faith. Muddy, ragged, and starving, and mistaking the effect for the cause, they judge us worthy of our abasement. Who could tell one of our faces from another? If, as the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas maintained, the face of the other calls out to us in its very vulnerability, requiring a moral response from us, then the erasure of the face is the essence of totalitarianism. If you want a picture of the future, the state functionary O'Brien tells George Winston at the end of Orwell's 1984, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. But other animals, too, have faces. And just as the Nazis tattooed their prisoners with numbers, we brand farmed animals and staple numbered tags to their ears, not merely to control them, but to efface their individuality. In 1940, Joseph Goebbels, the German minister of propaganda, commissioned a film entitled Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew, the most notorious of the many films made by the Nazis depicting Jewish people as worthless vermin. To depict Jews as parasites living off the body of the German Volk, the Nazis resorted to cinematic tautology, employing film footage taken inside the very ghettos that the Nazis themselves had created and forced the Jews into. Images of starving Jews reduced to ghostly, abject figures suffering from disease, terror, and despair were then used by the Nazis to make the case for the Jews' own elimination. The Jew was not old or young, fat or thin, man or woman, farmer or student, but an eternal type, the Jewish bacillus, as Goebbels termed Jews in his personal diary. Like the Nazis, who crowded their victims into ghettos and concentration camps, we crowd animals into filthy, airless warehouses, zoos, and concentrated animal feeding operations, then use their misery as proof of their abjection. At the zoo, capuchin monkeys chase one another on concrete perches and fake trees, covered in their own feces and driven half-mad by the relentless gaze of thousands of gawking human primates. Penguins, crowded onto plastic ice at the aquarium, are ridiculed by children for their stink. Confronted with undercover video footage of pigs lying prostrate in their own urine and excrement on the killing floor, moaning, we may turn away in disgust at their filth. Mistaking the effect for the cause, we judge other animals to be worthy of their debasement and deaths at our hands. Farmed animals born with disabilities or who get sick or don't grow fast enough are seen not as vulnerable individuals, but as ballast existenzen to be disposed of, like the worthless humans the Nazis termed unnütze Esser, useless eaters. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic shut down slaughterhouses and disrupted supply chains for meat, eggs, and dairy, the animal industry disposed of its sudden surplus of unproductive animals using ventilator shutdowns. Tens of millions of chickens and pigs were locked inside airless warehouses. Heat was pumped in, and the animals were effectively baked alive, dying in agony of heat stroke and dehydration over the course of hours or days. The procedure was deemed humane by the American Veterinary Medical Association, an organization which, though popularly associated with one's friendly local vet, is in fact a ruthless appendage of animal agribusiness, a leading institutional culprit in collapsing the distinction between caring for animals and killing them. In his story, The Letter Writer, published in The New Yorker in 1968, the Nobel Prize-winning Yiddish author, Isaac Bashevis Singer, explicitly compared our treatment of animals to the Nazis' treatment of their victims. The story's protagonist is a New Yorker named Henry Gombiner, a vegetarian whose parents, grandparents, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles, and cousins all died in the Holocaust. Like his story's protagonist, Isaac Bashevis Singer was himself a New Yorker, an ethical vegetarian, and a Holocaust survivor whose family was killed by the Nazis. Gombiner, who lives alone in an apartment building, befriends a mouse who lives there too. One day, watching the mouse sip from a saucer of water he has set out for her, he assures her, "Holy creature, no harm will come to you." Reflecting on the injustice of a world that would treat even a mouse as unworthy of life, Gombiner reflects, what do they know, all these scholars, all these philosophers, all the leaders of the world, about such as you? They have convinced themselves that man, the worst transgressor of all the species, is the crown of creation. All other creatures were created merely to provide him with food, pelts, to be tormented, exterminated. In relation to them, all people are Nazis. For the animals it is an eternal Treblinka. Charles Patterson, a former researcher at Yad Vashem, borrowed this last phrase of Singer's for the title of his book, Eternal Treblinka, Our Treatment of Animals and the Holocaust. The French philosopher Jacques Derrida, one of the most influential philosophers of the late 20th century, also saw parallels between Nazism and our treatment of other species. A Sephardic Jew raised in colonial Algeria, as a student he was expelled from a lycée under the anti-Semitic ordinances of the Vichy regime. Derrida maintained that there are also animal genocides, and he went so far as to observe, with scandalous irony, that whereas the Nazis sought to slaughter the Jews once and for all, humans instead reproduce animals ad infinitum so that they might be exterminated by means of their overpopulation, as if Instead of throwing people into ovens or gas chambers, let's say Nazi, doctors and geneticists had decided to organize the overproduction and overgeneration of Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals by means of artificial insemination, so that, being more numerous and better fed, they could be destined in always increasing numbers for the same hell, that of the imposition of genetic experimentation or extermination by gas or fire. Do such comparisons offend us because they reduce human victims to mere animals, or because they equate human civilization with the Third Reich? Part of the unique horror of the Shoah was the victims' knowledge that they were being targeted not merely as individuals or families, but as an entire people or race. Like other genocides, the Shoah therefore inflicted a type of psychological and spiritual suffering that may be unique to human beings, owing to our capacity for complex language and historical understanding. In all other ways, however, the animals we kill suffer as we do. Furthermore, the empathic and social capacities of other species, coupled with their superior senses, enable them to experience the collective suffering of others. Elephant survivors of human violence exhibit signs of PTSD. Rescued baby elephants who witnessed their mothers being killed by poachers wake up in the night screaming, and young adult elephants from decimated herds have been observed enacting sexual violence against hippopotamuses, a symptom of breakdown in the norms governing elephant culture. During the annual massacre of dolphins in Taiji, when Japanese fishers kettle and then stab to death hundreds of dolphins at once, the dolphins cry out to one another using their unique names, while parents try frantically but in vain to protect their young. There can be no doubt that in their final moments during such pogroms, the dolphins suffer in the awareness of the collective murder of their clans. In my introduction, I suggested that our treatment of animals is not merely wrong, but a form of radical evil. There is indeed no other term adequate to the scale of the extreme violence we inflict on the other beings, or the suffering that results from it. Nor is there another word that more aptly captures the horror of our own existential condition, which rests upon a universal crime in which we are all implicated, yet to which we are all indifferent. Sartre observed that while many antisemites would not do the Jews the least harm themselves, they also would not raise their little fingers to protect them from violence. Likewise, though many people would declare themselves against factory farms, few would bother to raise their little fingers on behalf of the animals trapped within them. Most are instead content to coast along, without questioning how the chicken or pork on their plates got there. The antisemite, Sartre writes, chooses to find his being entirely outside himself, disappearing into the hateful mob in order not to look within. What he flees even more than reason is his intimate awareness of himself. Speciesism likewise shifts our gaze outward, away from moral reflection and self-knowledge. In our unchecked supremacy over other beings, we thereby apprehend ourselves as what we are not, the world's only intelligent life form, and the only being whose existence has worth, while pretending that we are not what we are, animals ourselves. In short, we use both our differences from other animals and our similarities to them as justification for our violence against them. As Mephistopheles observes to God in Goethe's Faust, the little god of earth remains the same queer sprite as on the first day or in primal light. His life would be less difficult, poor thing, without your gift of heavenly glimmering. He calls it reason, using light celestial just to outdo the beasts in being bestial. If, as Sartre claimed, antisemitism is fear of the human condition, the same can be said of speciesism. We refuse responsibility for our freedom, telling ourselves that we have no choice but to go on hurting and killing the other beings, when instead we could choose compassion over violence. We choose speciesism, so to say, and in so doing we choose ourselves, but for the worse.